1913. Fall Asleep to Hilarious History. The Moving Belt and the Taxman's Hand by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The 16th Amendment. The Eternal Subscription. By the year of our Lord 1913, the human race had become dangerously convinced of its own permanence. We had wired the world like a ball of yarn in a cat's parlor. We had replaced the noble, stubborn horse with the temperamental, exploding motor car. And we were quite certain that we had finally outsmarted the more primitive impulses of our ancestors. We were, in a word, smug. It is a well-documented law of the universe that whenever humanity begins to feel particularly pleased with itself, the universe decides to trip it over a loose rug. In 1913, that rug was the 16th Amendment. For centuries, the American government had managed to keep its lights on by taxing things people did, like bringing tea into a harbor or making whiskey in a bathtub. This was a gentleman's arrangement. If you didn't want to pay the tax, you simply stopped drinking tea or gave up the bathtub gin, though the latter was considered a grave sacrifice. But in February of 1913, the United States government looked at its citizens and had a revolutionary, somewhat predatory thought: why tax what they do when we can simply tax what they are? And so the income tax was born. It was the moment the government decided that your labor was actually a joint venture between you and a group of men in wool suits in Washington, D.C., men you had never met, would never invite to dinner, and who certainly weren't helping you haul the hay or balance the ledgers. The charming fairy tale of only the rich. The beauty of the 16th Amendment lay in its marketing. If there is one thing politicians have mastered better than the art of spending other people's money, it is the art of convincing the public that they are only going to spend the other guy's money. In 1913, the public was told that the income tax was a class tax, not a mass tax. It was a tiny, polite nibble, a mere 1%, taken only from those fortunate souls earning more than $3,000 a year. To put that in perspective, in 1913, $3,000 was enough to buy a very respectable house, several fine horses, and perhaps a small village in the Midwest. The average worker, earning about $800 a year, looked at this proposal and cheered. "Eat the rich," they cried from their porches, not realizing that the government's appetite is famously insatiable, and that they were, in fact, the dessert course. It was a charming fairy tale, the kind you tell children to get them to go to sleep, or taxpayers to get them to sign away their autonomy. We were told it was a temporary measure to offset the lowering of tariffs. If history has taught us anything, it is that there is nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. I suspect that if you told a man in 1913 that within a century the government would not only be taking a third of his paycheck, but would also require him to fill out a 100-page document explaining why he shouldn't have to give them a fourth, he would have picked up his musket and started the revolution all over again. But in 1913, we were too civilized for muskets. We had fountain pens now, and the fountain pen, as it turns out, is much more efficient at cleaning out a man's pockets. The birth of the 1040, a Lovecraftian horror. Then came the Form 1040. It was originally a modest 3-page affair. It didn't ask for much, just your name, your earnings, and a pinky promise that you weren't lying. It was almost quaint. It was the introductory offer of a subscription service that you can never, ever cancel. The government assured the populace that the process would be so simple that any man of average intelligence could complete it in an afternoon. This was the first great lie of the modern bureaucracy. They failed to mention that average intelligence would soon be redefined to include an intimate knowledge of Byzantine legal codes and the ability to find loopholes that would make a Jesuit priest blush. The 1040 was the beginning of the professional confusion industry. Before 1913, a man knew where he stood. He had his money in his pocket, and the government had the sun and the moon. After 1913, a man had to hire a specialist to tell him how much of his own money he was allowed to keep. It turned every citizen into a part-time accountant and a full-time skeptic. Death and taxes, the inevitable marriage. It was Benjamin Franklin who famously said that in this world nothing is certain except death and taxes. But until 1913, they were at least separate events. Death was a one-time tragedy. Taxes were a series of minor annoyances. The 16th Amendment effectively married the two. It ensured that from the moment you earned your first nickel to the moment they lowered you into the ground, the taxman would be standing right there beside you, holding his hat and waiting for his cut. It made the government a silent, unhelpful ghost partner in every business transaction, every promotion, and every lucky break. If you made a profit, the government was your brother. If you made a loss, you were an orphan. We were told it was for the common good. We were told it would build the roads and the bridges, as if we hadn't been building roads and bridges for thousands of years without needing to know exactly how much a blacksmith earned in July. The truth is, the income tax didn't just fund the government, it inflated it. It gave the beast a taste for blood. And once a beast knows that the supply of blood is tied directly to the sweat of its subjects, it tends to encourage a lot of sweating. The psychology of the shakedown. There is a particular kind of psychological gymnastics required to be a taxpayer. You must convince yourself that you are a contributing member of society, while simultaneously feeling like you've been mugged in broad daylight by a man who then uses your own money to buy a megaphone so he can tell you how much you owe him for the mugging service. In 1913, the American public accepted this with a shrug. We were focused on the future. We had the Panama Canal to finish. We had Grand Central Terminal to open. We were too busy being a great power to worry about a few pennies on the dollar. But those pennies were the seeds of a sprawling, leafy jungle of bureaucracy that would eventually grow to cover the entire landscape. We traded a little bit of our privacy and a little bit of our property for the promise of a more organized society. And we got exactly what we asked for. A society so organized that you can't buy a loaf of bread without a paper trail that can be seen from space. Looking back from the edge. As we sit here in 1913, looking out over the horizon of the 20th century, we feel very modern. We feel very sophisticated. We have the 16th Amendment, and we have a government that finally has the resources to do big things. We don't know yet that those resources will soon be used to fund the most industrial, soul-crushing war in human history. We don't know that the 1% tax will soon become 10%, then 20%, then more. We are like a man who has just signed up for a free trial of a magazine, unaware that he has actually signed a contract that allows the publisher to move into his spare bedroom and eat all his cheese. So, let us toast to the year 1913, the year we officially became employees of the state, the year we decided that freedom was a bit too messy and that what we really needed was a subscription to civilization. It's a long, funny, and occasionally heartbreaking road from here to the present. But at least we have the crossword puzzle to keep us busy while we're on hold with the Internal Revenue Service. Chapter 2. The 17th Amendment. Senators by popular demand. If the 16th Amendment was the government's way of reaching into your pockets, the 17th Amendment was its way of asking for your permission to do it, while making you feel like the most important person in the room. In 1913, we decided that the American people, in their infinite and often questionable wisdom, should be the ones to choose their senators directly. Before this, the United States Senate was essentially the most exclusive social club in the world, with a membership fee that usually involved owning a railroad, a steel mill, or, at the very least, a state legislature. Under the old system, the common voter didn't get to touch the Senate. It was handled by the state politicians in smoke-filled rooms where the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent exchange of favors. It was a refined, dignified sort of corruption. But by 1913, the public had grown tired of the Millionaires' Club. They wanted a seat at the table. And so we changed the Constitution to ensure that instead of being bought by a handful of wealthy men in a private room, our senators would now have to be bought by thousands of people in a very public circus. We called this progress. The dignity of the smoke-filled room. To understand why we changed the rules, you have to understand the old way of doing things. In the 19th century, the Senate was intended to be the cooling saucer for the hot tea of the House of Representatives. The House was where the rabble-rousers and the firebrands lived, men who were elected every 2 years and were therefore perpetually terrified of their neighbors. The Senate, however, was supposed to be a gathering of elder statesmen chosen by state legislatures to represent the state's interests, not the people's whims. In practice, this meant that if you wanted to be a senator, you didn't need to kiss babies or hold town halls. You just needed to be very good friends with about 40 guys in your state capital who had a flexible sense of ethics. It was efficient. It was quiet. And it resulted in a Senate that was remarkably consistent in its primary goal, making sure that the people who already had money got to keep it. By the turn of the century, however, the cooling saucer had become more of a gilded cage. State legislatures were frequently paralyzed by deadlocks, where they couldn't agree on a candidate for months, leaving Senate seats vacant while the politicians argued over who owed whom for a bridge project in the northern counties. The public looked at this and decided that if the politicians were going to be incompetent, the people might as well have the fun of picking the particular flavor of incompetence. The great populist delusion. The 17th Amendment was sold as a victory for the common man. It was the ultimate power to the people move. We were told that by electing senators directly, we would wash away the stain of bribery and ensure that the voice of the farmer and the factory worker would ring out in the hallowed halls of Washington. It was a lovely sentiment. It was also a massive misunderstanding of how human nature works when you give it a megaphone. The moment you move from electing a senator in a private room to electing one in a public square, the skill set required for the job changes entirely. You no longer need to be a master of policy or a titan of industry. You need to be a performer. You need a booming voice, a sturdy handshake, and the ability to look a man in the eye and promise him that you will lower his taxes, raise his wages, and make sure his neighbor's dog stops barking, all at the same time. A politician is a man who will double-cross that bridge when he comes to it. And the 17th Amendment ensured that he would have to do a little dance while crossing it to keep the crowd cheering. Suddenly, the Senate wasn't a place for the wise and the wealthy. It became a place for the loud and the likable. We traded the Millionaires Club for a popularity contest. And then we were shocked to find that the winners were the people who were best at telling us exactly what we wanted to hear, regardless of whether it was physically possible or legally sane. The birth of the modern campaign trail. With the 17th Amendment, the campaign trail was born in earnest. Before 1913, a prospective senator might have had to convince a few dozen legislators. After 1913, he had to convince a few 100,000 voters. This required a level of stamina and a lack of shame that the old-school aristocrats simply didn't possess. This was the era of the whistle-stop tour. A candidate would hop on the back of a train, roll into a small town, give a 20-minute speech about the glory of the Republic and the treachery of his opponent, shake 300 hands, and then disappear in a cloud of steam before anyone could ask him a specific question about the silver standard. It was marvelous theater. It turned politics into a spectator sport, right alongside baseball and public hangings. The voters loved it. They felt empowered. They felt seen. They didn't realize that the man on the back of the train was using the exact same smoke and mirrors as the men in the back rooms, just with a larger budget for bunting and brass bands. The irony of representation. There is a profound irony in the 17th Amendment that we often overlook while we're busy waving our little flags. By making senators elected by the people, we effectively turned the Senate into a second House of Representatives. Originally, the two houses were meant to represent different things. The House represented the people, and the Senate represented the states. It was a balance of power. But once the 17th Amendment passed, the states as political entities lost their seat at the federal table. The governor of New York and the legislature of Ohio suddenly had no more say in Washington than the man selling newspapers on the corner. We gained a vote, but the states lost their sovereignty. We streamlined the process, but we also removed one of the major brakes on the federal government's power. Without the state legislatures acting as a gatekeeper, the federal government was free to grow as large and as loud as the voters' appetites allowed. And as we discovered with the 16th Amendment, those appetites are usually bigger than our wallets. The legacy of the 1913 Shuffle. So, here we are in 1913. We have a government that can tax our income directly, and we have a Senate that has to beg us for our votes every 6 years. We feel very advanced. We feel like we have finally perfected the machinery of democracy. We believe that by bringing the light of public scrutiny to the Senate, we have made it honest. We haven't noticed that the light of public scrutiny often just causes the cockroaches to move faster and learn how to wink at the camera. The 17th Amendment didn't end corruption, it just democratized it. It made us all complicit in the choices we made. If the Senate is a circus, we can no longer blame the guys in the smoke-filled rooms. We have to look in the mirror and realize that we are the ones who bought the tickets and cheered for the clowns. But at least the clowns are our clowns. And in 1913, with the world seemingly on the brink of a new era of peace and prosperity, we were happy to keep the show going. We didn't know that the next few years would require a lot more than a good stump speech to survive. We were just happy to have our say, even if our say was mostly just shouting over the noise of the Ford Model Ts rolling off the new assembly lines. Chapter 3. The Federal Reserve Act, the Bank for Banks. If you have been following along with our little tour of 1913, you might have noticed a recurring theme. The American government was behaving like a man who has just discovered a hardware store and is determined to fix every leak in the house, regardless of whether the house was actually leaking or if he is simply bored with the plumbing. Having already secured a direct line to your wallet with the 16th Amendment and a direct line to your ego with the 17th, the government decided it was time to address the most temperamental, volatile, and prone to seizures member of the American family, the economy. For most of the 19th century, the American economy operated on a principle that can best be described as scream and leap. Every 20 years or so, someone would realize that there was more paper in the world than there was gold in the vaults. Everyone would panic, the banks would lock their doors, and the public would spend 6 months trading chickens for boots until things settled down. It was chaotic, it was terrifying, and it was, above all, highly unprofessional. By 1913, we were far too sophisticated for such primitive dramatics. We decided that if the economy was going to have a nervous breakdown, it should do so under the watchful eye of a committee of experts with plenty of leather-bound ledgers and a very impressive seal of office. We decided to create the Federal Reserve, the ghost of 1907. The impetus for this grand experiment was the panic of 1907. That particular crash was so spectacular that it required the intervention of a single, very grumpy, very wealthy man named J.P. Morgan. Morgan basically sat the nation's leading bankers down in his library, which, to be fair, was larger than most European principalities, locked the doors, and told them they couldn't leave until they had collectively coughed up enough cash to save the country. It worked, but it was deeply embarrassing for the United States government. It is one thing to be a great power. It is quite another to be a great power that has to ask a man with a particularly large cigar and a magnificent nose to bail you out of a liquidity crisis, like a college student asking his father for rent money. The politicians in Washington looked at J.P. Morgan and said, "We need a system where we don't have to rely on a billionaire's library. We need a system where we are the librarians." And so the quest for a central bank began, though they were very careful not to call it a central bank, because Americans have an instinctive, almost allergic reaction to that phrase, dating back to the time Andrew Jackson spent his presidency trying to beat the second bank of the United States to death with a stick. The secret duck hunt at Jekyll Island. To design this new system, a group of men did what men in 1913 did best. They went on a secret trip. In late 1910, a small cabal of senators and bankers boarded a private train car under assumed names, pretending they were going on a duck hunting expedition to Jekyll Island, Georgia. It is one of the great ironies of history that the foundation of the modern American financial system was laid by a group of billionaires pretending they didn't know what a dividend was, while wearing flannel shirts and carrying shotguns. They weren't hunting ducks, of course. They were hunting for a way to make the money supply elastic. Elasticity is a wonderful word in the world of finance. It sounds flexible, accommodating, and gentle. In reality, an elastic currency means that when the banks need more money, the government can simply stretch the definition of money until it fits. It was the birth of the idea that if you don't have enough gold to back your promises, you can just make the promises louder and print them on nicer paper. Woodrow Wilson, the professor's signature. By the time 1913 rolled around, the Jekyll Island Plan had been scrubbed, bleached, and renamed the Federal Reserve Act. It was presented to President Woodrow Wilson, a man who looked like he had been born in a three-piece suit and who treated the presidency as if it were a particularly long, slightly disappointing faculty meeting. Wilson loved the idea. He was a progressive, which in 1913 meant he believed that there was no problem in the world that couldn't be solved by a sufficiently large number of bureaucrats with PhDs. He signed the act into law on December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, as a gift to the nation. It was a bit like getting a set of encyclopedias for Christmas. You knew it was important and good for you, but you secretly wished you'd just gotten the gold. The act created 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, overseen by a board of governors in Washington. It was a hybrid system, half public, half private, and entirely confusing. It was designed to ensure that the money supply could expand and contract like a pair of lungs. This, we were told, would end the boom and bust cycle forever. The professionalization of the crash. We were promised stability. We were promised a scientific approach to prosperity. We were told that the Federal Reserve would be the lender of last resort, a financial safety net that would catch us whenever we tripped over our own greed. What we actually got was a system that replaced the panic with the recession. Instead of a sudden, violent explosion that cleared the air, we traded it in for a slow, simmering leak that lasted for years. We discovered that while you can make a currency elastic, you cannot make human nature elastic. If you tell a group of bankers that there is a safety net waiting to catch them, their first instinct is not to walk more carefully. It is to see how high they can jump before they fall. The Federal Reserve didn't stop the economy from crashing. It simply ensured that when it did crash, the post-mortem would be conducted by men with very impressive credentials. It turned the mysterious wild beast of the market into a laboratory animal. And as any scientist will tell you, when you put an animal in a lab, it stops behaving like itself and starts behaving like something that wants to bite the scientist. The stationery of stability. One of the most enduring legacies of the Federal Reserve Act was the sheer amount of paperwork it generated. Before 1913, money was a relatively simple concept. You had it or you didn't. After 1913, money became a monetary policy. It became discount rates and open market operations. It became a thing that was managed. It also gave us the modern Federal Reserve note. If you look at a dollar bill today, you'll see the words Federal Reserve Note right at the top. It is essentially a very fancy IOU from a bank for a bank. It is the physical manifestation of the 1913 promise. Don't worry, we've got this under control. I suspect that if you told a farmer in 1913 that his money was now managed by a board of governors in Washington, he would have checked his pockets and moved his savings into a hole under the barn. But the urban, sophisticated American of 1913 was delighted. He felt that he was living in a scientific age. He had a car, he had an income tax, he had a popularly elected senator, and now he had a scientific bank. He was prepared for anything, except, of course, for 1929. But that was 16 years away, and in 1913, 16 years felt like an eternity. The trifecta of 1913. With the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, the great trifecta of 1913 was complete. The government now had the power to tax your labor. The public had the power to elect the Senate, and the bank for banks had the power to manage the value of the very coins in your pocket. The stage was set. The house had been replumbed, the wiring had been updated, and the insurance policy had been signed. We felt invincible. We were a nation of experts now, and we were certain that nothing could possibly go wrong. It is a pity that history doesn't read the reports of the experts. If it did, it might have been more polite about what happened next. But for now, let us leave the bankers to their ledgers and the politicians to their speeches. The world is changing, and as we move into Section 2, we shall see that while the government was busy organizing our wallets, the engineers were busy organizing our lives. Chapter 4. Grand Central Terminal opens. The Cathedral of the Commute. Having spent the previous chapters discussing how the government secured a permanent seat at your dinner table and a key to your safe deposit box, it is time to turn our attention to something far more aesthetic, though no less expensive. In February of 1913, New York City unveiled a structure that proved, once and for all, that even if humanity was destined to be taxed and regulated into oblivion, we intended to look absolutely magnificent while waiting for the train. I am speaking, of course, of Grand Central Terminal. Now, to call Grand Central a train station is like calling the Pacific Ocean a puddle. It was, and remains, a cathedral of the commute. It was a temple built not to a god, but to the American obsession with being somewhere else as quickly as possible. In 1913, the New York Central Railroad, under the watchful, profit-hungry eyes of the Vanderbilt family, decided that the humble act of traveling from Poughkeepsie to Manhattan deserved a backdrop of Bavarian marble, Tennessee limestone, and a ceiling painted with the very stars of the heavens. The Vanderbilt ego in stone. The Vanderbilts did not do things by halves. When your family name is synonymous with owning the horizon, you do not build a wooden shack with a ticket window. You build a palace. The Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had started the trend, but his descendants in 1913 wanted to prove that they had moved beyond the gritty, soot-stained world of steam engines and into the polished, silent world of the electric age. You see, before 1913, the area around 42nd Street was a hellish landscape of smoke, ash, and the occasional explosion. Steam locomotives would chug into the city, belching black soot onto the laundry of the poor and the top hats of the rich alike. It was a democratic sort of filth. But electricity changed the game. Because electric trains didn't breathe fire, they could be tucked away underground. This allowed the architects to build upward. They created a massive Beaux-Arts masterpiece that looked more like a Roman forum than a transit hub. It was a statement to the world. We have conquered the elements, we have tamed the lightning, and now we would like you to buy a ticket to Stamford. The celestial ceiling, a divine typo. The centerpiece of the main concourse is naturally the ceiling. It is a sprawling turquoise-green map of the zodiac, shimmering with gold leaf and 2,500 stars. It was intended to make the weary traveler look up and feel a sense of cosmic wonder. However, in a move that I find deeply comforting and quintessentially human, the painters managed to get the entire universe backward. If you stand in the center of Grand Central and look up, you will notice that Orion is facing the wrong way and the constellations are mirrored. When this was pointed out to the authorities in 1913, they did what any self-respecting organization does when they've made a colossal, expensive mistake. They claimed they did it on purpose. They argued that the ceiling was painted from God's perspective, looking down from above the stars, rather than from the perspective of the lowly commuter looking up. It is a magnificent bit of PR. It implies that if you are confused by the layout of the stars, it is simply because you aren't holy enough to understand the blueprints. It is the architectural equivalent of saying, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Personally, I suspect the painter was simply holding his map upside down, but in 1913, we preferred the divine perspective explanation. It fit the smugness of the era much better. The architecture of self-importance. Everything about Grand Central was designed to make the individual feel both very small and very important at the same time. The windows are 60 feet high, allowing the sun to cut through the dust in long, dramatic shafts of light, making every bank clerk and seamstress look like they are appearing in a miracle. The staircases were modeled after the Paris Opera House. Why? Because the Vanderbilts believed that walking to a platform should feel like an opening night performance. They understood a fundamental truth about New Yorkers. They are always in a hurry, but they want everyone to notice how well they are dressed while they're doing it. Even the clocks were masterpieces of excess. The four-sided clock atop the information booth is made of opal, and at the time it was valued at enough money to buy a small fleet of those newfangled Ford motor cars. It stands there as a reminder that in Grand Central, time is not just a measurement, it is a luxury. In a city that never sleeps, the clock is the only thing that is allowed to stand perfectly still. The Whispering Gallery and the Oyster Bar. But the genius of the terminal wasn't just in the marble, it was in the secrets. Tucked away in the lower levels is the Whispering Gallery, an archway where the acoustics are so precise that you can whisper a secret into one corner and have it heard perfectly by someone standing in the opposite corner, 30 feet away. In 1913, this was considered a marvel of engineering. Today, it is mostly used by tourists to say, "Can you hear me?" to their bored spouses. But in the early days, one imagines, it was the site of many a clandestine business deal or a romantic tryst, proving that even in a cathedral of stone, the most important thing we can do is gossip. And then, of course, there is the Oyster Bar, because nothing says, "I've just arrived in the greatest city on earth," quite like eating a chilled mollusk in a basement lined with Guastavino tiles. It was the ultimate 1913 experience, high-speed electric travel, followed immediately by the slowest, most traditional meal known to man. It was the intersection of the future and the prehistoric, served on a bed of ice. The 5:15 to immortality. Grand Central Terminal was a victory for the human spirit, or at least for the human ego. It told us that our daily grind, the tedious act of going to work and coming home again, was worthy of a monument. It suggested that even if your job was to add up columns of figures in a windowless office, you deserved to begin and end your day in a palace. It was the final flourish of an era that believed beauty was a public utility. We were building for the centuries. We weren't just putting up a transit facility. We were carving our aspirations into the bedrock of Manhattan. We believed that the world would always be this grand, this organized, and this gilded. As the doors swung open in 1913 and the first commuters flooded the concourse, they weren't just catching a train. They were walking through a gateway to a new century. They didn't know that the world outside those marble walls was about to become very loud and very messy. They just knew that for a few brief moments, under a backward sky of gold-leaf stars, they felt like minor deities. And really, for the price of a train ticket, what more could you ask for? Chapter 5. The Moving Assembly Line, the Ford Miracle. In the early months of 1913, if you had visited the Highland Park plant in Michigan, you would have witnessed the birth of a miracle, or the beginning of a nightmare, depending on whether you were the one owning the factory or the one standing inside it. This was the year Henry Ford decided that the human race was moving entirely too slowly, and that the only way to catch up with our own ambitions was to turn every workman into a highly specialized, slightly disgruntled component of a giant ticking clock. Before 1913, building a motor car was a leisurely, almost poetic affair. A group of men would gather around a chassis like a quilting circle, sharing stories, perhaps a bit of tobacco, and occasionally attaching a wheel or a fender when the spirit moved them. It took 12.5 hours to produce a single Model T. It was craftsmanship. It was artisanal. And to Henry Ford, it was an absolute catastrophe of inefficiency. Ford looked at his workers and saw something terribly wasteful: movement. He realized that every time a man walked 20 feet to pick up a wrench, the march of progress stalled. He decided that from now on, the man would stay perfectly still, and the work would come to him, riding atop a relentless, clanking, uncompromising moving belt. The rope and the revolution. The moving assembly line didn't start with high-tech robotics or complex pulleys. It started with a heavy rope and a few men dragging a car chassis across the floor like a stubborn mule. Ford and his engineers timed the process with stopwatches, hovering over the men like vultures over a dying wagon train. They discovered that by breaking the assembly down into tiny, repetitive tasks, the tightening of one specific bolt, the attachment of one specific wire, they could strip away the need for thinking and replace it with reflex. By the end of 1913, the time to build a Model T had plummeted from over 12 hours to a mere 93 minutes. It was the most significant leap in productivity since the invention of the whip. Ford hadn't just built a better car, he had built a machine that built cars. And that machine was made of flesh, blood, and a growing sense of existential dread. The interchangeable man. The beauty of the assembly line from a managerial perspective was that it rendered the skilled craftsman obsolete. In the old world, if your master mechanic decided to go on a fishing trip, your production line stopped. In Ford's new world, you didn't need a mechanic. You needed a man with a right arm and the ability to stand in one place for 9 hours without losing his mind. If a man quit or fainted or simply wandered off into the woods to scream, you could pluck a stranger off the street, show him how to turn nut number 42 to the right, and have the line moving again in 5 minutes. We had achieved the dream of the industrial age. We had finally made human beings as interchangeable as the parts they were installing. It was the ultimate democratization of labor. Any man could be a Ford man, provided he was willing to trade his soul for a steady rhythm. This was the Ford miracle. It allowed for the mass production of the Tin Lizzie on a scale that defied the imagination. The price of the Model T began to drop, eventually reaching a point where even the people building the cars could afford to buy one, assuming they still had the energy to drive after a shift on the line. Any color you want, as long as it's black. It was during this era that Ford issued his most famous and most hilariously stubborn edict. Any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants, so long as it is black. This wasn't because Henry Ford had a particular fondness for the somber hues of a funeral procession. It was, like everything else in 1913, a matter of cold, hard efficiency. Black Japan enamel dried faster than any other pigment. On a moving assembly line, you couldn't have cars sitting around for 3 days waiting for a lovely shade of sunset crimson to dry. That would be a bottleneck. And in Highland Park, a bottleneck was a sin worse than heresy. The world became a bit more uniform in 1913. The individuality of the carriage was replaced by the identical, soot-colored reliability of the Model T. We were beginning to realize that the price of affordable for everyone was exactly the same as everyone else's. The $5 day, the golden handcuffs. However, there was a problem with the miracle. The work was so mind-numbingly boring, so repetitive, and so soul-crushing that workers were quitting in droves. In 1913, Ford had to hire 52,000 men just to keep a workforce of 14,000 at the benches. The labor turnover was more of a labor stampede. To combat this, in early 1914, the direct result of the 1913 experiments, Ford announced the $5 day. At a time when the average industrial wage was about $2.30, this was an explosion. It was the shot heard round the world for the middle class. People flocked to Detroit from all corners of the globe, convinced that Henry Ford was a saint. But the saint had a sociological department. To earn that $5, you had to prove you were a worthy citizen. Ford's agents would visit your home to ensure you weren't drinking too much, that your house was clean, that you weren't taking in boarders, and that you were properly Americanized. It was a total package. Ford didn't just own your movements on the assembly line. He wanted to own your character in the living room. He wanted to ensure that the man who tightened the bolts on the Model T was as predictable and standardized as the bolt itself. It was the birth of the consumer class, but it came with a side of corporate surveillance that would make a modern social media algorithm blush. The legacy of the belt. As 1913 drew to a close, the moving belt had changed the heartbeat of the planet. We had transitioned from the age of the individual to the age of the mass. We could produce more, travel further, and buy cheaper than any generation in history. We were faster, sleeker, and more efficient. But as the Model Ts rolled off the line every few minutes, one couldn't help but wonder if we were the ones driving the cars or if the cars were now driving us. We had mastered the moving belt, and in doing so, we had set a pace for modern life that would never, ever slow down. The assembly line was a miracle of engineering, but it was also a promise. From now on, the world would move at the speed of the machine, and God help the man who stopped to tie his shoe. We were civilized, we were productive, and we were all quite literally on the same track. Chapter 6. Stainless Steel, the End of Rust. While Henry Ford was busy turning the American worker into a metronome in Michigan, a man named Harry Brearley was wandering through the soot-choked streets of Sheffield, England, trying to solve a problem for the British military. It is a recurring irony of our species that some of our greatest domestic comforts are born from our tireless efforts to find more efficient ways to poke holes in one another. In 1913, Brearley wasn't looking for a better way to spread butter. He was looking for a better way to shoot people. Sheffield at the time was the steel capital of the world, a place so thick with coal smoke and industrial grime that the local birds were rumored to be born already covered in soot. The air was heavy with the scent of sulfur and the constant rhythmic thrum of giant hammers. In this atmosphere of productive gloom, Brearley was experimenting with alloys. The British Small Arms Committee was annoyed that their rifle barrels were eroding too quickly under the heat and friction of modern gunpowder. They wanted a metal that wouldn't fouling or wear away. They wanted a super steel. Brearley, a man who possessed the stubborn patience required of a metallurgist, began mixing various amounts of chromium into his steel vats. He was essentially a high-stakes chef, tossing ingredients into a metallic soup to see what would happen. He tried 6% chromium, 10%, 12%. He cast the samples, polished them, and subjected them to the usual indignities of a laboratory. And for his intended purpose, he failed. None of the alloys were particularly good for gun barrels. They were too hard to work with, or they didn't take the rifling well, or they simply weren't what the military was looking for. And so, like any sensible scientist who has spent months on a failed project, Brearley took his useless samples and tossed them onto the scrap heap in the corner of his laboratory. The miracle of the scrap heap. Weeks passed. In the damp, corrosive air of Sheffield, a scrap heap of steel is usually a death sentence for metal. Within days, iron begins its slow, inevitable surrender to oxygen. It turns orange, then brown, then disintegrates into a fine, melancholic dust. It is nature's way of reclaiming what we have stolen from the earth. However, one afternoon in late 1913, Brearley noticed something peculiar. While the rest of his failures were turning into a pile of rust, one specific sample, the one with 12.8% chromium, remained as bright and shiny as the day it was cast. It sat there in the middle of the carnage, gleaming like a polished diamond in a coal bin. It refused to rust. It refused to tarnish. It looked at the damp English air and essentially said, "Not today." Brearley was fascinated. He took the sample back to his bench and tried to etch it with nitric acid, the standard test to reveal the structure of a metal. The acid, which usually eats through steel like a hungry dog through a steak, simply slid off. The metal was immune. He had discovered what we now call stainless steel, though at the time, Brearley, being a man of science rather than a man of marketing, referred to it as rustless steel. The resistance of the knife makers. You would think that the discovery of a metal that doesn't rot would be met with universal acclaim, parades, and perhaps a small statue in the town square. But Brearley quickly discovered that the world is often very attached to its inconveniences. He took his rustless steel to the local cutlery manufacturers in Sheffield. These were men who had been making knives the same way for 300 years. They used carbon steel, which made for a very sharp edge, but also required the user to spend half their life polishing the blade with a knife board and various abrasive powders to keep it from turning into a jagged piece of orange flint. The cutlery masters were unimpressed. "It won't hold an edge," they grumbled. "It's too hard to grind, it's too expensive." But what they were really saying was, if we sell a man a knife that never rusts, he'll never need to buy another one from us. Innovation is a wonderful thing until it threatens the planned obsolescence that keeps a guild in business. They told Brearley that his steel was a novelty, a curiosity, perhaps good for a few ornamental baubles, but certainly not for the serious business of the dinner table. The marketing genius of the stainless. The breakthrough came when Brearley met a man named Ernest Stewart, a cutlery manager at Mosley's. Stewart tested the metal in a way that spoke to the heart of the common man. He dipped it in vinegar. Then he rubbed it with lemon juice. Then he let it sit in a bowl of salty water. When the blade emerged from this gauntlet of domestic acids without a single spot, Stewart realized that rustless was the wrong word. People didn't just hate rust, they hated the stains that fruit and food left on their utensils. He dubbed it stainless steel. It was a stroke of genius. Rustless sounds like a technical specification. Stainless sounds like a promise of purity. It promised a world where the housewife didn't have to spend her Saturday mornings scrubbing the forks. It promised a kitchen that stayed bright without the sweat of the brow. By 1914, the stainless revolution was underway. Suddenly, the kitchen knife was no longer a temporary tool that would eventually become a slow-motion pile of orange dust. It was a permanent heirloom. You could buy a set of spoons and reasonably expect your great-grandchildren to use them to eat their breakfast in the year 2013. The end of the orange dust era. The impact of Brearley's accident cannot be overstated. Before 1913, the world was a very rusty place. Bridges had to be painted constantly just to keep them from falling into the river. Steamships were in a perpetual state of being eaten by the sea. Surgery was a terrifying gamble involving instruments that were difficult to sterilize and prone to corrosion. Stainless steel changed everything. It gave us scalpels that could be boiled without falling apart. It gave us the modern food industry, where giant vats of milk and beer could be kept in pristine, non-reactive containers. Eventually, it would give us the gleaming skyscrapers of the Art Deco era and the jet engines that would shrink the world. But in 1913, it was just a shiny piece of scrap that refused to die. It is a humbling thought that one of the most important materials of the modern age was discovered because a man was trying to build a better gun and failed so thoroughly that he threw his work in the trash. It reminds us that progress is rarely a straight line. More often, It's a zigzag through a junkyard where the most valuable thing you find is the thing you weren't looking for. Brearley eventually left his firm in a dispute over the patent rights, proving that while steel can be stainless, the business world remains as messy as ever. But he left behind a world that was a little bit brighter, a little bit cleaner, and significantly less orange. Chapter 7. The Armory Show, the Cubist Scare. If the early months of 1913 had been dedicated to the government taking your money and the factory taking your soul, February was the month the art world decided to take your sanity. It was the month that modern art arrived in America, landing on the shores of Manhattan like a confused, multi-angled Viking invasion. For decades, the American public had a very simple, comfortable relationship with art. A painting was supposed to be a window. You looked at it and saw a bowl of fruit that looked like a bowl of fruit, or a landscape of a valley that made you want to buy a cow and move there. If there was a person in the painting, they generally had the correct number of eyes, and those eyes were usually located on the front of the face. It was a gentleman's agreement. The artist promised not to lie to you, and you promised to nod politely and say, "How lifelike." Then came the International Exhibition of Modern Art, held at the 69th Regiment Armory in New York. History remembers it simply as the Armory Show. It was organized by a group of rebellious American artists who were tired of the Academy and its obsession with dead Greeks and beige landscapes. They wanted to show America what the Europeans, those masters of absinthe and existential angst, had been up to. They brought over 1,200 works of art, and for the average New Yorker, walking into that armory was like walking into a room where the laws of physics had been replaced by the fevered dreams of a very angry carpenter. The explosion in the shingle factory. The undisputed heavyweight champion of the Armory Show's absurdity was a Frenchman named Marcel Duchamp. He submitted a painting with the deceptively straightforward title, Nude Descending a Staircase, number 2. Now, when a gentleman in 1913 heard the word nude, he generally expected a certain level of, nudity. He expected soft curves, a bit of marble-like skin, and perhaps a strategically placed leaf. What he did not expect was a series of overlapping, brown, wooden-looking geometric shards that appeared to be falling down a flight of stairs in a state of high-speed mechanical failure. The public was baffled. The critics were incensed. One reviewer famously described the painting as an explosion in a shingle factory. Another suggested it looked like a collection of leather straps or an elevated railroad collision. People stood in front of it for hours, squinting, tilting their heads, and trying to find the nude. It was the first time in American history that looking at a painting required the same level of concentration as solving a murder mystery, and with roughly the same amount of frustration. Duchamp had committed the ultimate sin of 1913. He had painted a process rather than a person. He had captured motion, but in doing so, he had shattered the human form into 1,000 pieces of kindling. To the American eye, which was still getting used to the idea of a moving assembly line, the idea of a moving painting was a step too far into the abyss. The wild beasts and the color of madness. But Duchamp wasn't alone. The Armory Show also introduced America to the fauves, or the wild beasts. These were artists like Henri Matisse, who believed that if you felt like painting a woman's face bright green, you should simply go ahead and do it. To the critics of 1913, Matisse was not an artist. He was a common criminal. They accused him of drawing like a child and assaulting the optic nerve. They couldn't understand why anyone would want to look at a painting that didn't respect the natural order of the grocery store. If a lemon was yellow in real life, it should be yellow on the canvas. To suggest otherwise was considered a form of moral rot, a sign that the very fabric of Western civilization was beginning to fray at the edges. The American public, ever the lovers of a good scandal, flocked to the show in droves. They didn't necessarily go to be enlightened. They went to laugh. They went to mock. They went to confirm their suspicion that the old world had finally lost its mind. Students from the Art Students League burned Matisse in effigy. People wrote letters to the newspapers claiming that the exhibition was a subversive plot to undermine American values. It was the birth of the great American art debate, which can be summarized as, "My 5-year-old could do that," versus "You just don't get it, man." Teddy Roosevelt weighs in. No event in 1913 was truly official until Theodore Roosevelt showed up to give his opinion, usually in the form of a verbal sledgehammer. The former president visited the Armory show and, in a surprising turn of events, didn't immediately try to shoot the paintings. However, he wasn't exactly a fan. He wrote a famous critique in which he compared the European modernists to the lunatic fringe. He was particularly offended by a painting that he claimed looked like a shabby Turkish rug. Roosevelt, a man who liked his reality rugged and his art recognizable, saw the Armory show as a symptom of a world that was becoming too soft, too inward-looking, and too disconnected from the strenuous life. But even Roosevelt had to admit that the show had energy. It was bull-bully in its own deranged way. It was a punch in the face to the status quo, and if there was one thing Teddy Roosevelt respected, it was a good punch in the face. The pine tree and the New World. The symbol of the Armory show was a pine tree borrowed from the flag of the American Revolution. The organizers wanted to signal that this was a new era of independence. They wanted to liberate the American artist from the shackles of realism. And in a strange way, they succeeded. By the time the show packed up and moved to Chicago, where the outrage was even louder and the effigies even bigger, the damage had been done. The window had been smashed. The American public realized that art didn't have to be a mirror. It could be a hammer. It could be a joke. It could be a mathematical equation. It could be a nude descending a staircase that looked like a pile of lumber. The Armory show taught us that truth in art was no longer about how well you could draw a cow. It was about how well you could express the feeling of the cow, or the speed of the cow, or the shattered geometric essence of the cow. The legacy of the Cubist scare. As 1913 rolled on, the Cubist scare faded into the background, replaced by the more pressing concerns of the income tax and the rising price of coal. But the seeds had been planted. Modernism had arrived, and it wasn't going anywhere. We had entered an age where the world was moving too fast to be captured by a still life. The assembly line was humming, the subways were roaring, and the shingle factory of modern life was exploding every single day. The artists of the Armory show were simply the first people to admit that the world didn't make sense in 3D anymore. So the next time you walk into a museum and see a painting that looks like a tragic accident involving a bucket of paint and a ceiling fan, remember 1913. Remember the outrage, the laughter, and the shingle factory. We have Marcel Duchamp to thank for the fact that we can now look at a blank white canvas and call it a masterpiece. And we have the Armory Show to thank for the fact that we can spend 4 hours arguing about it. It was the year art stopped being a polite conversation and started being a riot. And as we shall see in the next chapter, it wasn't just the painters who were starting to get rowdy. Chapter 8, The Rite of Spring, the Paris Riot. If the Americans in 1913 were content to simply mock modern art with shingle factory jokes and the occasional effigy burning, the French, being a more passionate and theatrical people, decided that the only appropriate response to a shift in cultural paradigms was a full-scale, well-dressed riot. In May of 1913, at the brand-new Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, Igor Stravinsky and the Ballet Russe premiered Le Sacre du Printemps, or The Rite of Spring. It is widely considered the most important musical debut of the 20th century, primarily because it is the only time in history a ballet has required a police escort and resulted in a countess hitting a businessman over the head with her silk fan. To understand the scale of the disaster, you have to understand what the Parisian elite expected from a ballet. They expected tutus. They expected grace. They expected music that sounded like a gentle breeze rustling through a field of lavender. They did not expect a primal, percussive assault that sounded like a locomotive having a panic attack in a jungle. The bassoon that broke the world. The evening began with a single bassoon, but Stravinsky, in a fit of musical sadism, had written the solo so high in the instrument's register that it didn't sound like a bassoon at all. It sounded like a strangled swan. The audience was confused from the first note. A few chuckles rippled through the upper tiers. The old guard in the expensive boxes began to shift uncomfortably, wondering if the musician had a terminal illness or if the instrument had been crushed in the stage door. But this was merely the appetizers. The real meat of the evening arrived when the curtain rose and revealed the dancers. Usually, ballerinas spend their time trying to defy gravity, floating on their toes like ethereal spirits. In The Rite of Spring, the legendary choreographer Václav Nijinsky had instructed them to do the exact opposite. They were pigeon-toed. They were hunched over. They were stomping their feet into the floor with the rhythmic subtlety of a pile driver. They looked less like the Swan Queen and more like a group of very athletic peasants who had just realized they left the oven on. The Aesthetic Civil War. About 5 minutes into the performance, the theater transformed from a temple of high culture into a boxing ring. The audience was divided into two warring factions. On one side were the aesthetes, the young radical students and artists who believed that anything that made the old people angry must be genius. On the other side were the traditionalists, the wealthy patrons who had paid a small fortune for their tickets and felt that Stravinsky was personally insulting their ancestors. The shouting started almost immediately. "Shut up!" yelled the radicals. "Get a dentist!" yelled the traditionalists, a reference to the dissonant stabbing chords in the orchestra. Soon the verbal insults turned physical. Gentlemen in tuxedos began to grapple with students in corduroy. Society ladies stood up in their boxes and hissed like geese. One man was reported to have rhythmically beaten his neighbor's head with his walking stick to the beat of the music, proving that, even in a riot, the French maintain a certain sense of rhythm. Stravinsky's Great Escape. Behind the scenes, the situation was even more chaotic. Igor Stravinsky, the man responsible for this auditory carnage, was so horrified by the reaction that he fled the auditorium. He spent the rest of the performance standing in the wings, holding on to Nijinsky's coattails. Nijinsky himself was standing on a chair, screaming numbers at the dancers in Russian, 1, 2, 3, 24, because the music was so loud and the shouting from the audience so deafening that the dancers couldn't hear the orchestra. They were dancing in a vacuum of sheer, unadulterated hatred. The impresario, Sergei Diaghilev, was the only one who seemed happy. He stood in the lobby, flicking the lights on and off in a futile attempt to calm the crowd, while inwardly celebrating the fact that he had just achieved the greatest publicity stunt in the history of show business. He knew that in Paris, a success is a pleasant evening, but a scandal is an immortality. The music of the future. Why were they so angry? It wasn't just that the music was loud, it was that it was dishonest to their ears. Stravinsky had discarded the civilized rules of harmony. He used polytonality, which is a polite way of saying he played two different keys at the same time to see who would win. He used irregular rhythms that made it impossible to tap your foot without breaking an ankle. He had stripped away the pretty mask of the 19th century and revealed the pounding, primitive, terrifying heart underneath. In 1913, the world was pretending to be sane, but Stravinsky knew better. He was writing the soundtrack for a century that was about to go violently, spectacularly off the rails. The audience thought they were witnessing a musical failure. In reality, they were witnessing the birth of the modern world. It just happened to sound like a drum kit falling down a flight of stairs. The aftermath. From riot to classic. By the time the final dancer collapsed on stage, representing the chosen one, who dances herself to death, a light-hearted romp for the whole family, the police had arrived to haul away the most combative patrons. The critics went home to sharpen their quills, calling the piece the rite of destruction and the massacre of the ear. But here is the punchline of history. A year later, when the music was performed again in Paris, this time without the dancing, Stravinsky was carried through the streets on the shoulders of the crowd like a conquering hero. The riot of 1913 had become the legend of 1914. Humanity had caught up to the noise. We realized that the stabbing chords weren't an assault. They were an awakening. We have spent the last 100 years trying to sound as radical as Stravinsky did on that May night, usually with far less success and significantly fewer silk fan-related injuries. Today, we use The Rite of Spring in Disney's Fantasia to show dinosaurs dying in the mud. It is considered educational and stately. We play it in symphony halls to polite applause from people who are mostly worried about whether they remembered to pay the babysitter. But for one night in 1913, music was dangerous. It was a physical threat. It was a reason to punch a stranger. And if you ask me, that is the highest compliment you can pay to an artist. Chapter 9. The First Crossword Puzzle. The Word Cross Infection. By December of 1913, the average American had been through a great deal. He had been taxed by the government, organized by Henry Ford, confused by the Cubists, and deafened by Stravinsky. He was understandably looking for a way to sit down in a quiet corner and engage in a hobby that didn't involve a riot or a federal auditor. He was looking for a harmless little diversion. On December 21st, Arthur Wynne, a British-born journalist for the New York World, decided to fill a bit of empty space in the fun section of the Sunday edition. He drew a diamond-shaped grid, left the center hollow, and filled it with clues. He called it a word cross. He had no way of knowing that he had just released a cognitive virus that would eventually claim more human hours than the building of the pyramids and result in more domestic arguments than the invention of the mother-in-law. It was the birth of the crossword puzzle, and it was the final, quietest revolution of 1913. The desperate editor's invention. Arthur Wynne was not a man who set out to change the way the human brain processes language. He was simply an editor, with a hole in his layout. He remembered a game his grandfather had shown him called Magic Squares, a simple Victorian word game. He decided to complicate it, adding black squares, eventually, and numbered clues. The first puzzle was remarkably simple. The clue for 2 to 3 was an animal of prey, and the answer was lion. The clue for 4 to 5 was something that is found on the shore, and the answer was sand. It was quaint. It was innocent. It was the gateway drug of linguistics. Within weeks, the readers of the New York World were hooked. They weren't just solving the puzzles. They were demanding more. They were writing letters. They were obsessing over 4-letter words for Egyptian sun god. Wynne had accidentally tapped into a fundamental, somewhat pathological human desire, the need to fill in an empty box. The mental plague of the 1920s. While the crossword began in the dying days of 1913, it spent the next decade becoming a full-blown epidemic. By the mid-1920s, it was no longer a game. It was a national crisis. People were bringing dictionaries to dinner parties. Railroads reported that commuters were missing their stops because they were stuck on a 7-letter word for type of ornamental shrub. The high-minded critics of the day were horrified. They viewed the crossword puzzle as a sign of the total collapse of the American intellect. The New York Times, which would ironically go on to become the high priest of the crossword, initially looked down its nose at the trend, calling it a sinful waste of time and a primitive sort of mental exercise. The crossword puzzle, one critic wrote, is the most ridiculous and fatuous occupation that has ever fascinated the mind of man. It is a scourge that robs the worker of his industry and the student of his focus. It was described as a mental plague. Librarians in New York complained that crossword fiends were hogging the dictionaries and encyclopedias, preventing serious researchers from doing their work. There were even reports of people being fired for puzzling on the job, the 1913 equivalent of being caught watching cat videos on the company dime. The psychology of the clue. Why did it work? Why did a society that was already being pulled in 1,000 directions by the Industrial Revolution suddenly decide to spend its Sunday mornings agonized over a 3-letter word for a flightless bird? The answer lies in the nature of 1913 itself. The world was becoming increasingly complex, bureaucratic, and unpredictable. The income tax was a puzzle you couldn't solve. The Federal Reserve was a machine you couldn't see. But a crossword puzzle? That was a universe with rules. In a crossword, there is always a right answer. There is a perfect fit. When you find that word, when rare-y finally connects with egg, you feel a momentary sense of godlike order. It is a tiny victory over chaos. For a man living in a century that was about to break into a million jagged pieces, the ability to finish a 15 by 15 grid was the only form of control he had left. The great typo, from word cross to crossword. Even the name of the puzzle was an accident. Wynn's original word cross remained the title for a few weeks, until a typesetter at the New York World accidentally flipped the words, printing it as crossword. Wynn liked the rhythm of it better, or perhaps he was just too tired to correct it. Regardless, the name stuck. It is a perfect metaphor for the year 1913, a series of accidental collisions and typos that somehow became the permanent architecture of our lives. As the craze grew, it spawned an entire industry. The first book of crossword puzzles was published in 1924 by a new company called Simon & Schuster. They were so unsure of the book's success that they didn't even put their name on it, fearing it would ruin their reputation as serious publishers. The book came with a pencil attached, the first hardware/software bundle in history. It became a runaway bestseller, and Simon & Schuster went from being a nervous startup to a publishing giant, all on the back of people wanting to know another word for oboe. The legacy of the broken pencil. We are now over a century removed from Arthur Wynn's first diamond grid, and the infection shows no signs of clearing up. We have moved from the newsprint of the New York World to the glowing screens of our smartphones, but the impulse remains the same. We are still a species that cannot stand a blank white square. The crossword puzzle taught us how to think laterally. It taught us that bark doesn't just belong to a dog. It can also belong to a tree or a boat. It taught us that the English language is a playground of puns, traps, and hidden doors, but more importantly, it gave us a common language. Whether you were a billionaire in a Fifth Avenue penthouse or a coal miner in West Virginia, you were both looking for a 5-letter word for unhappy. The answer, of course, is upset, which describes the state of anyone who can't find the answer. As 1913 came to a close, the crossword puzzle stood as a quiet monument to human curiosity. Amidst the grand political shifts and the thundering of the assembly lines, Arthur Wynn reminded us that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is sit down, sharpen a pencil, and try to make sense of the letters in front of them. Section 3 is now complete. We have seen art go crazy, music start a riot, and the dictionary become a weapon of mass distraction. The year of smugness is nearing its end, but as we move into Section 4, we shall see that the very air around us and the tiny atoms within us were also yielding their secrets, secrets that would eventually make the word cross look like child's play. Chapter 10. The Bohr Model, the Solar System, in a Speck. By the summer of 1913, the human race had successfully reorganized its taxes, its politics, its travel, its assembly lines, and even its Sunday afternoon puzzles. We were, quite frankly, running out of things on the surface of the earth to poke with a stick. Naturally, this meant it was time to turn our attention to the things we couldn't see, couldn't touch, and couldn't explain without the use of a very expensive education and a high tolerance for madness. It was time to look at the atom, For a long time, scientists had treated the atom like a secret that wasn't particularly interesting. The word atom comes from the Greek atomos, meaning indivisible, which was a polite way of saying, we've hit a wall and decided to stop asking questions. But as the 19th century turned into the 20th, that wall began to crumble. We discovered that the atom wasn't a solid little billiard ball at all. It was a cluttered, buzzing, somewhat disorganized workshop of subatomic bits. Enter Niels Bohr, a young Danish physicist with a forehead large enough to house its own zip code and a mind that functioned on a level of reality several floors above the rest of us. In 1913, he published a series of papers that did for the atom what Henry Ford had done for the motor car. He gave it a system. The plum pudding problem. To appreciate Bohr's genius, you must first appreciate how ridiculous the previous theories were. For a while, the leading idea was the plum pudding model proposed by J.J. Thomson. He suggested that the atom was a sphere of positive electricity with negative electrons stuck in it like raisins in a pudding. It was a very British theory, delicious, stodgy, and entirely wrong. Then came Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealander who possessed the subtle grace of a grizzly bear. Rutherford discovered that the atom was mostly empty space, with a tiny, dense nucleus in the middle. He suggested that electrons orbited this nucleus like planets around a sun. This was much more exciting than pudding, but it had one fatal flaw. According to the laws of physics at the time, a moving electron should lose energy, spiral inward, and crash into the nucleus in a billionth of a second. According to Rutherford's model, the entire universe, including the chairs we sit on and the tea we drink, should have blinked out of existence several trillion years ago in a spectacular puff of logic. Since we were clearly still here, largely preoccupied with our new income taxes, something was missing. Bohr's magical thinking. Niels Bohr arrived in Manchester to work with Rutherford, and he brought with him a revolutionary idea. What if we just stop following the rules? Bohr suggested that electrons don't just fly around wherever they please. Instead, they are restricted to specific, quantized orbits. Think of it like a ladder. You can stand on the first rung or the second rung, but you cannot stand in the empty space between the rungs unless you have a very poor relationship with gravity. In Bohr's atom, an electron could live in orbit A or orbit B, but it was strictly forbidden from loitering in the suburbs in between. This was a direct assault on the common sense of 1913. In the macro world, if you want to move from the kitchen to the parlor, you have to pass through the hallway. But in Bohr's world, the electron simply vanishes from one orbit and reappears in another. We call this the quantum leap. It was the first time science admitted that at the very heart of reality, things are behaving like a poorly edited silent film. The solar system in a speck. The beauty of the Bohr model was its imagery. It took the vast, terrifying scale of the cosmos, the sun and its circling planets, and shrunk it down until it fit inside a speck of dust. It suggested a universal symmetry. It made us feel that the universe was a nested set of Russian dolls, where the very small followed the same elegant patterns as the very large. It was tidy. It was symmetrical. It was, in a word, smug. It gave the scientists of 1913 a sense of completion. We had the Bohr model for the small stuff, and we were working on the big stuff. We felt that we had finally mapped the blueprints of the Creator. We didn't know yet that Bohr's model was essentially a charming lie, a simplified version of a reality that is actually far more ghostly, smeared, and mathematically headache-inducing than a few neat circles. But Bohr didn't care if it was perfectly true. He cared if it worked, and it did. It explained why atoms emitted light in specific colors. It turned chemistry from a list of ingredients into a branch of physics. It gave us the key to understanding the periodic table, which had previously been organized with the same haphazard logic as a Victorian spice rack. The man who mumbled in riddles. Niels Bohr was not your typical mad scientist. He was famously polite, deeply philosophical, and spoke in a whisper that required his listeners to lean in so close they were practically sharing his oxygen. He once said, "An expert is a person who has found out by his own painful experience all the mistakes that one can make in a very narrow field." He was also the only man who could tell Albert Einstein he was wrong and make it sound like a compliment. Bohr understood that the atom was not something you could see. It was something you could only describe. He realized that language itself was a bit too clumsy for the quantum world. Trying to describe an electron with words like particle or wave is like trying to describe a symphony using only the words loud and squeaky. In 1913, Bohr was teaching us a new language. He was telling us that the solid world we lived in, the grand central marble, the stainless steel knives, the Ford Model Ts, was actually built out of vibrating, jumping, invisible ghosts. The scientific certainty of a ticking clock. The impact of the Bohr model on the 1913 psyche was profound. It reinforced the idea that we lived in a mechanical universe. We believed that if we could just find all the parts and understand all the gears, we could predict everything from the weather to the stock market. We viewed the atom as a tiny, perfect machine. And if the atom was a machine, and the factory was a machine, and the government was a machine, then surely the future was something we could manage with a clipboard and a stopwatch. This was the peak of human confidence. We had the Bohr model to explain our insides and the British Empire to explain our outsides. We felt that the long peace of the 19th century would continue forever, powered by the orderly, orbiting electrons of the new physics. We were like a child who has just learned how a clock works and assumes he is now the master of time itself. The legacy of the orbit. Of course, science eventually moved on. We discovered that electrons aren't really in neat orbits. They are more like a probability cloud, a fuzzy smear of maybe that only settles down when you look at it. The Bohr model is now considered an oversimplification, a beautiful relic of a more optimistic time. But we still teach it in every school on earth. Why? Because the human brain needs those little circles. We need to believe that there is an order to the chaos. We need the solar system in a speck to help us sleep at night, tucked away in a universe that makes sense. In 1913, Niels Bohr gave us that comfort. He gave us a glimpse into the basement of reality and told us that while the ghosts were jumping around, they were at least jumping according to a plan. It was a brilliant, witty, and slightly crazy answer to a question we had been asking for 2,000 years. As the year 1913 moved into its final months, the Bohr model stood as the crowning achievement of the year of smugness. We had mastered the invisible. We were the kings of the atom. We were ready for anything. And then, as we shall see in the next chapter, we discovered that while we were looking down at the atoms, we had completely forgotten to look up at the sky and the gas that was keeping us from being fried like bacon. Chapter 11. The Discovery of the Ozone Layer, the planet's invisible parasol. By late 1913, humanity was beginning to feel like the master of the house. We had organized the furniture, taxed the occupants, and even figured out that the floorboards were made of tiny jumping atoms. Having sufficiently explored the basement of reality, it was only natural that we should look up at the ceiling. We had always assumed the sky was just a vast, empty blue curtains, pretty to look at, but mostly there to give the birds something to do. We were wrong. In 1913, two French physicists named Charles Fabry and Henri Buisson discovered that the Earth was actually wearing a very thin, very fragile, and utterly essential suit of armor. They discovered the ozone layer. It is a classic 1913 story. We discovered the one thing protecting us from being turned into cosmic jerky by the sun at the exact same moment we were perfecting the industrial chimneys that would eventually start poking holes in it. It was the ultimate good news, bad news scenario, though in 1913 we were still far too smug to hear the bad news part. The French obsession with light. It is no coincidence that the ozone layer was discovered by Frenchmen. The French have a long-standing, borderline romantic obsession with light. Whether they are painting it, like Monet, fighting over it at the ballet, or measuring it, like Fabry and Buisson, they treat the sun as if it were a temperamental guest of honor at a dinner party. Fabry and Buisson weren't looking for a layer of gas. They were simply playing with a spectroscope, which is a fancy prism used to break light into its component colors. Think of it as a barcode scanner for the universe. By looking at the barcode of sunlight, you can tell exactly what the light had to pass through to get to your eyes. When they looked at the sunlight reaching Earth, they noticed something was missing. A significant chunk of the ultraviolet spectrum, the high-energy, angry light, simply wasn't making it to the ground. It was being intercepted. Somewhere, miles above the Eiffel Tower, something was acting as a bouncer, turning away the most dangerous rays before they could reach the dance floor. Ozone, the awkward third wheel. The culprit was ozone. To understand ozone, you have to understand its more famous cousin, oxygen. Normal oxygen, the kind that allows us to breathe and occasionally say foolish things, is made of two atoms hanging out together, O2. They are a stable, happy couple. Ozone, O3, is what happens when a third oxygen atom decides to crash the party. It is a crowded, unstable, and highly reactive arrangement. It's the awkward third wheel of the molecular world. On the ground, ozone is a nuisance. It's a component of smog and smells like a localized thunderstorm. But 12 miles up in the stratosphere, these third wheels are the only thing standing between you and a very short, very crispy life. Fabry and Buisson realized that if the atmosphere were just regular oxygen and nitrogen, we would all have been incinerated long ago. They calculated that there was a thin band of this strange, smelly gas encircling the planet. It wasn't a thick wall. If you brought the entire ozone layer down to sea level, it would be about as thick as 2 pennies stacked on top of each other. And yet, that 2-penny shield is enough to absorb 98% of the sun's high-frequency ultraviolet light. In 1913, we discovered that the planet had been child-proofed long before we arrived. The Earth's original SPF. Before 1913, if you had told a man that the sky was protecting his skin, he would have thought you were speaking poetically or perhaps having a religious vision. But Fabry and Buisson gave us the scientific proof that the Earth has a parasol. Imagine the sun as a giant, screaming ball of thermonuclear fire that is constantly trying to throw radiation rocks at us. The ozone layer is like a giant, invisible catcher's mitt, snagging those rocks before they can hit us in the face. Without it, the very DNA in our cells would begin to unravel like a cheap sweater. Plants would wither, the oceans would sterile, and the long peace of 1913 would have ended not with a war, but with a universal sizzle. Nature is like a cautious mother who puts a hat and sunscreen on her child before sending him out to play, even if the child is a 1913 industrialist who insists he doesn't need any help. The discovery was met with a polite, "Oh, how interesting," from the scientific community. It fit perfectly into the 1913 worldview. Yet another mystery solved, yet another system identified. We felt that the atmosphere was just another piece of well-oiled machinery, a celestial department store awning that required no maintenance and would last forever. The bliss of ignorance. What makes the 1913 discovery so poignant is what Fabry and Buisson didn't know. They didn't know about chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. They didn't know about aerosol hairspray or refrigerator coolants. They didn't know that the permanent shield they had found was actually quite delicate and prone to chemical attack. In 1913, the idea that a human being could break the sky was considered the stuff of bad science fiction. We were far too small, and the sky was far too big. We were still burning coal and driving Model Ts. We hadn't yet invented the specific brand of chemistry that would, 70 years later, cause a frantic global scramble to save the ozone. For the people of 1913, the ozone layer was just another reason to feel smug. It was proof that we lived in a Goldilocks world, a place perfectly designed for our comfort. We had the Bohr model to explain our atoms, the Federal Reserve to explain our money, and the ozone layer to explain why we weren't on fire. The architecture of the invisible. The discovery of the ozone layer changed our relationship with the sky. It was no longer just air. It was a structure, it had layers, it had functions, and it had a chemistry all its own. It taught us that the most important things in life are often the things we cannot see. Just as the most important part of a bank is the vault you aren't allowed to enter, the most important part of the atmosphere turned out to be the gas you weren't allowed to breathe. As the year 1913 tilted toward the autumn, the ozone layer sat silently in the stratosphere, doing its job with French precision. Fabry and Buisson went back to their laboratories, satisfied that they had mapped another corner of the universe. They had found the planet's parasol, and for a few brief decades we would all walk beneath it, blissfully unaware of how lucky we were to have it. But the sky wasn't done showing off. While the physicists were looking at the gases, the daredevils were looking at the clouds. And as we shall see in the next chapter, one man was about to prove that if the ozone layer was the ceiling, he was the one who was going to walk on it, upside down. Chapter 12. The First Loop the Loop. Entertainment or Error? By the autumn of 1913, humanity had successfully conquered the earth, the wallet, and the atom. We had built temples for our trains and assembly lines for our cars. But there remained one final frontier that continued to treat us with a mixture of cold indifference and occasional gravity-induced violence: the sky. In 1913, aviation was still in its experimental and terrifying phase. A flying machine was essentially a lawn chair attached to a kite, powered by an engine that had the reliability of a politician's promise and the temperament of a disturbed hornet. To fly was to gamble with the heavens, and for the first decade of flight, the rules were very simple. Stay upright, keep your eyes on the horizon, and for the love of all that is holy, do not, under any circumstances, look at the ground from an inverted position. Then came Adolphe Pégoud. Pégoud was a Frenchman, which is really all the explanation one should need. If there is a way to take a life-threatening situation and turn it into a chic, choreographed spectacle, you can bet your last franc that a Frenchman will find it. In September of 1913, Pégoud decided that the only thing wrong with aviation was that it was too sensible. He decided to prove that being upside down in an airplane was not a fatal error, but a lifestyle choice. The Blériot and the Brave, or Bored. The vehicle for this madness was a Blériot 11, a monoplane that looked like it had been constructed out of toothpicks and linen by a very ambitious spider. It had a wooden frame, wire bracing, and an open cockpit that offered the pilot a magnificent view of his impending doom. Before Pégoud, if a pilot found himself upside down, it was usually because a gust of wind had decided to end his career. In the early 1910s, inversion was a synonym for obituary. The prevailing wisdom was that if the blood rushed to your head while you were 1,000 feet in the air, your brain would simply surrender, and the plane, deprived of its dignity, would plummet to the earth like a discarded cigar butt. Pégoud, however, had a theory. He believed that if you kept the plane moving fast enough, the centrifugal force would keep you in your seat, and the plane would continue to function. He tested this theory by having his mechanics tie him into his seat with leather straps and then flipping the plane over on the ground to see if he liked the sensation. He did. This tells you everything you need to know about Pégoud's internal wiring. The loop heard round the world. On September 6, 1913, a massive crowd gathered at the Buck Airfield near Versailles. They hadn't come to see a transportation demonstration. They had come to see a man potentially turn himself into a very stylish pancake. Pégoud climbed into his Blériot, adjusted his mustache, which was aerodynamically significant in those days, and took to the sky. At an altitude of about 3,000 feet, he did the unthinkable. He dipped the nose, gathered speed, and pulled back on the stick. The plane climbed, leveled off, and then continued over onto its back. For several agonizing seconds, Adolphe Pégoud was looking at the French countryside through the top of his head. He was sustained by nothing but a few leather straps and a breathtaking amount of audacity. Then the nose dropped, the plane completed the circle, and he leveled out, right side up, as if he had simply been out for a Sunday stroll. He had completed the first loop the loop, or, as the French called it, with their characteristic flair for the dramatic, the boucle. The crowd didn't just cheer, They experienced a collective existential crisis. They had just witnessed a man break the most fundamental law of nature, the one that says humans are supposed to keep their feet towards the dirt and their heads toward the clouds. From fatal error to entertainment. The success of Pegud's loop changed the psychology of the 20th century. Up until that moment, the airplane was seen as a fragile, temperamental tool for getting from point A to point B, provided point B wasn't too far away and didn't involve any hills. After Pegud, the airplane became a performer. Suddenly, every pilot in the world wanted to be a stunt pilot. The sky was no longer a highway. It was a stage. Aerobatics was born, the art of being wrong on purpose. We began to see the tail spin, the barrel roll, and the wing walk. It was the beginning of the barnstorming era, where pilots would fly into small towns, land in a hayfield, and charge people $1 to watch them nearly die. It was a very 1913 phenomenon. We were so confident in our technology that we began to play with it like a toy. We had mastered the machine so thoroughly that we felt we could mock gravity itself. We forgot that while you can tease Mother Nature, she usually has a very long memory and a very short temper. The Pegud fever. Pegud became an international superstar. He toured Europe, performing his upside-down flight for kings, queens, and screaming teenagers. He was the first rock star of the air. In Russia, a pilot named Pyotr Nesterov actually performed a loop a few days before Pegud, but he didn't have the French PR machine behind him, so Pegud got the glory. History, much like a loop-the-loop, often favors the man with the best mustache and the loudest cheers. The doctors of the time were fascinated. They studied Pegud to see if his organs had swapped places or if his eyes had permanently relocated to his forehead. They were shocked to find that he was perfectly healthy. It turns out the human body is remarkably resilient to being tossed around like a salad, provided you don't hit the ground during the process. This realization led to a boom in air shows. Throughout the rest of 1913, thousands of people would gather every weekend to watch men in leather caps defy the laws of physics. It was the ultimate distraction from the darkening political clouds in Europe. Who cares about the Balkans when there's a man in a wooden kite doing a somersault over the Eiffel Tower? The dark side of the loop. However, as with everything in 1913, there was a shadow behind the spectacle. While Pegud was looping for fun, the military minds of the world were watching with a different kind of interest. They realized that if a pilot could maneuver a plane upside down, he could also maneuver it to stay behind an enemy. The stunt was the father of the dogfight. The very tricks that Pegud used to thrill the crowds in Versailles would, within 2 years, be used to shoot down young men over the trenches of the Somme. The entertainment of 1913 was the tactics of 1915. We were refining the art of flight just in time to use it for the art of destruction. Pegud himself would eventually become a combat pilot. He was the first ace in history, credited with 6 victories before he was shot down and killed in 1915. He died at the age of 26, proving that while you can fly upside down on purpose, the sky always demands its due eventually. The legacy of the inverted world. As we look back at the autumn of 1913, Pegud's loop stands as a perfect metaphor for the era. We were a world at its peak, feeling so secure in our progress that we thought we could turn the whole system upside down just to see what it looked like. We had the 16th Amendment taxing us, the Federal Reserve managing us, the assembly line moving us, and now we had the loop to entertain us. We were a species that had finally conquered its fears. We were brave, we were reckless, and we were quite certain that the future was ours to command. We didn't realize that the loop we were in was about to become a downward spiral. But for those few glorious months in 1913, we were all Adolphe Pégou, hanging by our straps, laughing at the ground, and feeling like the kings of a world that was, for the moment, perfectly, beautifully, and hilariously inverted. Chapter 13. The Suffragette Parade. The D.C. Chaos. If 1913 was the year humanity decided to organize the atom and the assembly line, it was also the year a significant portion of the population decided they were tired of being treated like a decorative, slightly fragile species of indoor plant. While the men in Washington were busy congratulating themselves on the new income tax and the scientific Federal Reserve, 5,000 women were quietly and then very loudly planning to ruin Woodrow Wilson's big weekend. On March 3, 1913, the day before Wilson's inauguration, Washington, D.C. witnessed a spectacle that would make a modern political rally look like a sleepy afternoon at the library. It was the woman suffrage procession, and it was the first time the movement decided to stop asking politely for the vote and start demanding it with sashes, brass bands, and a woman on a very large white horse. The arrival of the professor. Woodrow Wilson arrived at Union Station in Washington feeling, as he usually did, quite important. He expected a cheering crowd, a few waving hats, and perhaps a small child throwing rose petals. Instead, he found the platform virtually empty. When he asked where everyone was, a local official reportedly replied with the kind of bluntness that makes for great history. Over on the avenue, watching the woman's parade. It was the ultimate scheduling conflict of the 20th century. While the president-elect was checking into his hotel and wondering why his ego felt a bit deflated, a young, diminutive woman named Alice Paul was unleashing a logistical masterpiece on Pennsylvania Avenue. Alice Paul was not interested in the slow and steady approach of the older suffragettes. She didn't want to hold tea parties and write polite letters to senators who would just use them to light their cigars. She wanted a spectacle. She understood that in a world of moving assembly lines and exploding modern art, the only way to get people's attention was to make them drop their sandwiches in shock. The Valkyrie of Pennsylvania Avenue. The parade began with a vision that seemed to have been plucked directly from a Wagnerian opera. At the head of the procession sat Inez Milholland, a labor lawyer and socialite who was widely considered one of the most beautiful women in America. Alice Paul, being a master of the visual, put Inez on a magnificent white horse named Gray Dawn. Inez wore a flowing white cape, a star-crowned helmet, and a look of regal defiance that suggested she was about to conquer a small European nation rather than just march to the Treasury building. She was the general of the movement, a living symbol of the new woman, educated, athletic, and utterly uninterested in being told to go home and check on the roast. Behind her came thousands of women, organized by profession. There were doctors in their academic robes, nurses in their uniforms, librarians in their spectacles, and farmers in their sunbonnets. It was a clever piece of psychological warfare. It showed the public that women weren't just wives and mothers, though there were plenty of those too. They were the very engine of modern society. They were the ones keeping the schools open, the hospitals running, and the crossword puzzles solved. The bowler hat brigade and the dignity of men. The crowd that lined the streets was, to put it mildly, not entirely supportive. It was made up largely of men who had come to town for the inauguration, men who had spent the morning hydrating with Maryland rye, and who felt that women asking for the vote was roughly as sensible as a dog asking for a bank account. As the parade moved forward, the atmosphere turned from curious to hostile. The men in the crowd began to shout insults that were as imaginative as they were offensive. They told the women to go home to their kitchens. They told them they were unnatural. They asked them who was taking care of the children, conveniently forgetting that most of those men had left their own children at home to come to Washington and shout at strangers. But it didn't stop at shouting, because this was 1913, and the concept of law and order was still a bit elastic. The crowd began to surge into the street. They blocked the path of the marchers. They pulled women off the floats. They spat on them and slapped them with their gloves. And the police? The Washington, D.C. police force, under the leadership of a man named Major Sylvester, did exactly what you'd expect a group of men in 1913 to do when faced with a group of troublesome women. They watched. Some of them reportedly laughed. One officer was overheard telling a woman who was being harassed, "If you had stayed home, this wouldn't have happened." It was the original "she was asking for it" defense applied to the fundamental right of citizenship. The cavalry to the rescue. The chaos became so great that the parade ground to a halt. The women were trapped in a sea of angry, smelling of tobacco and rye men. It looked as though the great spectacle was going to end in a riotous disaster. Then came the cavalry. Literally, a troop of soldiers from nearby Fort Myer had to be called in to clear the route. They rode their horses into the crowd, pushing the hecklers back and creating a narrow corridor for the women to continue. It was a moment of profound irony. The women were marching for the right to participate in a democracy, and they had to be protected by the military from the very citizens they were trying to join. When the dust finally settled and the last float reached the end of the route, over 100 women had been hospitalized. But Alice Paul wasn't upset. She was thrilled. She knew that a nice parade would have been forgotten by dinner, but a chaotic parade that resulted in women being bullied by the police would stay on the front pages for weeks. She had succeeded in making the woman question the only thing anyone was talking about. Woodrow Wilson's inauguration the next day felt like a footnote. The professor might have been the one taking the oath of office, but the general on the white horse was the one who owned the headlines. The logic of the anti-suffragist. To the modern ear, the arguments against women voting sound like the ramblings of a man who has spent too much time huffing the exhaust of a Model T. The anti-suffragists, many of whom were women, argued that voting would unsex women. They claimed that the female brain was physically incapable of understanding the complexities of the tariff or the gold standard, conveniently ignoring that most male voters understood these things about as well as they understood the Bohr model of the atom. They argued that if women voted, they would stop having children, and the human race would simply wither away like a neglected garden. They believed that the purity of womanhood would be soiled by the dirty business of politics. It was the ultimate double standard. A woman was considered pure enough to raise the next generation of citizens, but too emotional to check a box on a piece of paper once every 4 years. In 1913, the suffragette parade proved that women were more than willing to get soiled if it meant they could finally have a say in the laws that governed their lives. They were done being the conscience of the nation from the sidelines. They wanted to be the ones holding the pen. The legacy of the chaos. The 1913 parade changed everything. It radicalized a generation of women. It moved the struggle from state-by-state skirmishes to a national war of attrition. It led to the Silent Sentinels, who would later picket the White House, the hunger strikes, and the eventual passing of the 19th Amendment. But in March of 1913, it was just a day of mud, insults, and a very tired white horse. It was the moment the long peace of the Victorian era finally cracked for the American woman. We had seen the assembly line turn workers into machines, and now we were seeing the fairer sex turn themselves into a political juggernaut. As Woodrow Wilson stood on the inaugural platform the next day, talking about the new freedom, he likely didn't realize that the freedom he was talking about was already being redefined by the women he had tried to ignore. The world was changing, and it wasn't just happening in the laboratories or the factories. It was happening in the streets, one sash and one white horse at a time. Chapter 14. Emily Davison and the Epsom Derby. The Horse and the Martyr. While the American suffragettes were busy choreographing parades and avoiding the Maryland rye-scented breath of the D.C. police, their sisters across the Atlantic in Great Britain were engaged in a struggle that made the Washington chaos look like a polite disagreement over a bridge hand. In 1913, the British suffragette movement, led by the indomitable and decidedly non-stationary Emmeline Pankhurst, had reached a stage of militancy that would have made a modern revolutionary pause for a moment to check his insurance policy. They weren't just marching. They were smashing windows with hammers they kept in their muffs, burning down unoccupied country houses, and blowing up the occasional postbox. It was a time when a British gentleman couldn't even mail a letter without wondering if his correspondence was about to be turned into a localized fireworks display. The motto was, "Deeds, not words," and by June of 1913, the deeds were becoming increasingly desperate. This brings us to Emily Wilding Davison, a woman who had already been arrested 9 times, gone on 7 hunger strikes, and been force-fed by the authorities more often than a prize goose in Strasbourg. In the eyes of the British government, she was a nuisance. In her own eyes, she was a soldier in a war that had been going on since the first man told the first woman she wasn't built for the heavy lifting of thinking. The Super Bowl of Edwardian high society. On June 4th, 1913, the entire British Empire turned its gaze toward the Epsom Derby. In the Edwardian era, the Derby was not merely a horse race, it was a sacred ritual of the English social calendar. It was a day when the class system took a field trip to the track. The king and queen were there, the aristocracy was dripping in pearls and top hats, and the commoners were gathered on the hill, betting their last shillings on beasts of burden with names like Aboyeur and Craganour. It was a scene of peak British order. The grass was green, the champagne was cold, and the king's horse, a chestnut colt named Anma, was ready to carry the royal colors to glory. It was the absolute last place on earth where one expected to see a fundamental breakdown of the social contract. the Tattenham Corner collision. The race began with the usual thunder of hooves and the polite cheering of people who are far too well bred to scream. As the horses rounded Tattenham Corner, the sharpest turn on the track, and the point where the speed is most terrifying, the pack began to string out. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from under the guardrail and onto the track. It was Emily Davison. She didn't look like a revolutionary. She looked like any other woman at the Derby, dressed in a sensible coat and hat. But she was carrying 2 Votes for Women flags, and she was moving toward the center of the thundering herd. To this day, historians argue about her intent. Some say she was trying to commit suicide to become a martyr. Others, pointing to the return train ticket and the invitation to a suffragette dance found in her purse, argue she was simply trying to pin a flag to the king's horse, the ultimate deeds, not words, publicity stunt. Regardless of the why, the how was a disaster of physics. Anmer, traveling at nearly 40 miles per hour and carrying the king's jockey, Herbert Jones, collided with Davison with a sickening thud. The woman was sent flying like a rag doll. The horse tripped and somersaulted, pinning the jockey beneath its 1,000-pound frame. The crowd didn't gasp. They went silent. It was a glitch in the matrix of the British Empire. For a few moments the world stood still, staring at a woman in the dirt, a royal jockey in a heap, and a king's horse struggling to its feet in a cloud of dust. The British reaction. But is the horse all right? The reaction of the British public in the immediate aftermath was a masterclass in the particular, often baffling priorities of the era. While Emily Davison lay unconscious with a fractured skull, the primary concern voiced by many in the crowd, and later in the newspapers, was for the horse and the jockey. The king, upon hearing of the incident, reportedly inquired after the health of Herbert Jones and Anmer. Queen Mary followed suit. The idea that a woman would dare to interrupt a royal horse race was seen by the upper classes not as a political statement, but as a grave breach of etiquette. It was as if she had insulted the king's mother and then spilled tea on his favorite rug. To the Edwardian mind, the sanctity of the Epsom Derby was far more important than the rights of half the population. You could argue for the vote in the newspapers, certainly, but you did not disturb the king's afternoon nap at the track. Davison died 4 days later in the hospital, never regaining consciousness. She became the martyr the movement hadn't necessarily asked for, but desperately needed. Her funeral was a sea of purple, white, and green, with thousands of women marching in a silent, somber procession through the streets of London. It was the 1913 version of a state funeral, proving that while the government could ignore a living woman, they couldn't ignore a dead one. Herbert Jones and the ghost of Anmer. Spare a thought, if you will, for Herbert Jones, the jockey. He survived the fall, but he was never the same. He spent the rest of his life haunted by the image of that woman stepping out from the rail. It is a tragic postscript to the event that years later, after attending the funeral of Emmeline Pankhurst, Jones was found in a room filled with gas, having taken his own life. It was a grim reminder that the deeds of 1913 had a human cost that rippled outward far beyond the political headlines. The struggle for the vote wasn't just a series of slogans and sashes. It was a grinding, painful collision of 2 different worlds, the old world of royal privilege and the new world of individual agency. The legacy of the Epsom Derby. The Epsom Derby of 1913 remains one of the most captured moments of the early 20th century, thanks to the fact that it was one of the first major events filmed by multiple movie cameras. You can still watch the grainy black and white footage today. The horses blurring past, the sudden flutter of a coat, the chaotic tumble of man and beast. It didn't win women the vote immediately. If anything, it gave the anti-suffragists more ammunition to claim that women were hysterical and unbalanced. But it did something more profound. It removed the possibility of indifference. After the Derby, you could no longer ignore the suffragettes. They were no longer just troublesome women. They were a force of nature that was willing to stand in front of a galloping horse to be heard. As 1913 moved into the sweltering heat of the summer, the tragedy at the Derby hung over the British Isles like a persistent fog. We were realizing that the long peace wasn't just being threatened by the Kaiser or the Balkan tensions, it was being dismantled from within by a demand for justice that refused to wait for a convenient time. We had mastered the atom, we had mastered the assembly line, and we had mastered the crossword puzzle. But we were finding it remarkably difficult to master the simple concept that a person should have a say in their own governance, regardless of whether they wore a corset or a top hat. Chapter 15, The Webb-Kenyon Act, Dry Counties and Wet Dreams. By the middle of 1913, the American government was behaving like a frantic housekeeper who, having already rearranged the heavy furniture and scrubbed the ceiling, has now decided to climb into the pantry and start sniffing the bottles of vanilla extract. We had already seen the great fixers in Washington reorganize the money supply, the voting of senators, and the very structure of the atom. Naturally, the only thing left to solve was the eternal, unquenchable thirst of the American male. It is a curious fact of history that while women were marching in the streets for the right to participate in democracy, another group, the teetotalers, was marching for the right to ensure that nobody else could participate in a cold beer on a Tuesday afternoon. In March of 1913, Congress passed the Webb-Kenyon Act, a law that would eventually be viewed as the pilot episode for that 12-year-long national tragedy we call Prohibition. The problem of the original sin of shipping. To understand the Webb-Kenyon Act, you have to understand the peculiar geography of American morality in 1913. Much like a quilt made by a blindfolded ant, the country was a patchwork of wet and dry jurisdictions. You could live in a county where buying a bottle of whiskey was considered a moral catastrophe. But if you walked across a bridge or waded through a creek, you'd find yourself in a place where the local tavern was the center of social, political, and spiritual life. The problem, as the prohibitionists saw it, was the original sin of interstate commerce. Even if a state had bravely declared itself dry, usually after a series of sermons that would have made the devil himself feel like he needed a glass of water, the federal government still insisted that people could ship booze across state lines. It was a loophole large enough to drive a wagon load of bourbon through. A man in a dry town in Georgia could simply write a letter to a gentleman in a wet town in Kentucky, and a few days later, a mysterious heavy box would arrive at his door labeled tractors or religious pamphlets, but clinking with the unmistakable music of glass against glass. The Busybody's Manifesto. The Webb-Kenyon Act was designed to close that loophole. It made it illegal to ship alcoholic beverages into any state where the sale of such beverages was prohibited. It was the government's way of saying, if your state says you're on a diet, the federal government isn't going to help you smuggle in the cake. The logic behind this was deeply rooted in the progressive spirit of 1913. There was a widespread belief that the demon rum was the root of all evil, the cause of poverty, domestic strife, and the reason men occasionally forgot to tighten the bolts on Henry Ford's moving assembly line. If you could just remove the liquid, the theory went, the American man would suddenly become a paragon of industry, sobriety, and punctuality. It was a beautiful, shining, wet dream of a sober republic. It was also a total misunderstanding of the human animal. You can pass a law to stop a man from buying a drink, but you cannot pass a law to stop a man from wanting a drink. And when a man wants a drink and a law tells him he can't have one, the drink doesn't go away. It simply becomes a hobby. Taft's final stand and final veto. The passing of the Webb-Kenyon Act provided us with one last glimpse of William Howard Taft before he lumbered out of the White House to make room for Woodrow Wilson. Taft was a man of significant proportions and, more importantly, a man who possessed a very stubborn, very literal respect for the Constitution. Taft looked at the Webb-Kenyon Act and, in a rare moment of presidential clarity, declared it unconstitutional. He argued that the federal government could not delegate its power over interstate commerce to the individual states. He saw it as a messy, dangerous precedent that would turn the national border into a series of 48 tiny bickering custom houses. And so Taft vetoed the bill. He did it with the dignity of a man who knows he is right, but also knows he is about to be ignored. Congress, which by 1913 was being pursued by the dry lobby like a pack of hounds after a fox, wasted no time. They overrode the president's veto with a thunderous majority. It was the first time in history that a major piece of social legislation was forced through over the constitutional objections of the executive. It was a sign that the moral crusaders had officially taken the wheel, and they weren't particularly interested in reading the map. The golden age of the bootlegger. If the Webb-Kenyon Act did anything, it acted as a massive federal scholarship program for the future leaders of organized crime. Before 1913, bootlegging was a small-scale local affair, something handled by men who lived in the woods and knew how to talk to mules. After 1913, it became a sophisticated multi-state enterprise. The act didn't stop the flow of alcohol. It just increased the price and the excitement. Suddenly, the local postmaster in a dry county became the most important man in town. Every package had to be inspected, every crate sniffed. It turned the simple act of receiving mail into a game of cat and mouse that would have delighted a detective novelist. It also encouraged the invention of the suitcase whiskey and the hollowed-out Bible. It proved that when you make something illegal, you don't destroy the market. You just hand the keys to the people who are willing to break the law to serve it. By the time 1913 was over, the dry counties were wetter than ever, but the money was no longer going to the taxman. It was going to the men in the fast cars who knew how to avoid the local sheriff. The irony of the 16th Amendment. There is a profound, almost poetic irony in the fact that the government passed the income tax the 16th Amendment and the Webb-Kenyon Act in the same year. For decades, the federal government had relied on the liquor tax to pay its bills. In 1912, nearly a third of all federal revenue came from taxes on spirits. By passing the income tax, the government had finally found a way to divorce itself from the bottle. They no longer needed people to drink to keep the lights on in Washington. They could now afford to be moral. They had replaced the sin tax with the success tax. It was the ultimate bait and switch. The government told the people they could be sober, but only if they were willing to pay for the privilege out of their own paychecks. This shift in the business model of bureaucracy is what made prohibition possible. Without the 16th Amendment, the drys would never have succeeded, because the government would have gone bankrupt within a week of the bars closing. But in 1913, we had mastered the art of the eternal subscription. We were now paying for our own moral guidance, whether we wanted it or not. The legacy of the dry experiment. As 1913 rolled on, the Webb-Kenyon Act stood as a monument to the idea that you can legislate human character. We believed that if we could just fix the environment, the individual would follow. We were a nation of engineers, after all. We had fixed the assembly line, we had fixed the atom, and we were quite sure we could fix the soul. We didn't realize that the dry experiment was the beginning of a massive, decades-long expansion of federal police power. We didn't know that the bootlegger would become the anti-hero of the American mythos. We were just happy that we were doing something about the social ills of the day. As the sun set on the dry counties of 1913, a man in Georgia probably sat on his porch, opened a crate that was labeled hymn books, and poured himself a glass of very fine, very illegal Kentucky bourbon. He toasted to the Webb-Kenyon Act, to the progressive era, and to the fact that no matter how many laws the government passed, the grass would always be green, the stars would always be backward in Grand Central, and a man could always find a drink if he knew the right postman. Section 5 is now complete. We have seen the struggle for the vote and the struggle for the bottle, two movements that, in their own way, were both trying to define what it meant to be a citizen in the modern world. One wanted the right to speak, the other wanted the right to stop others from drinking. It was a very 1913 kind of balance. Chapter 16. Filling the Panama Canal, the ocean's blind date. By October of 1913, the human race had reached a level of audacity that would have made the builders of the Tower of Babel look like a group of cautious home renovators. We had spent the year reorganizing our money, our atoms, and our social hierarchies. But there remained one glaring geographic inconvenience that simply would not do. The continent of South America was still attached to North America. For centuries, if a captain in New York wanted to get a cargo of pianos to San Francisco, he had to sail all the way down to the bottom of the world, dodge icebergs at Cape Horn, and pray to whatever deity handles maritime insurance that he wouldn't be swallowed by a rogue wave. In 1913, we decided that instead of going around the obstacle, we would simply perform a radical 1,000-mile lobotomy on the Earth's midsection. We were going to cut the world in half, and October was the month we finally turned on the taps. The French failure and the American stubbornness. To understand the triumph of 1913, one must first appreciate the spectacular failure of the 1880s. The French, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who had successfully dug the Suez Canal and was consequently feeling a bit too confident, had arrived in Panama with high hopes and a lot of very chic hats. They tried to dig a sea-level canal, essentially trying to carve a straight ditch through a mountain range. Nature responded with a resounding "non." Between the landslides that filled the trenches as fast as they were dug and the mosquitoes that treated the French workforce like an all-you-can-eat buffet, the project collapsed into a heap of bankruptcy and yellow fever. By the time the Americans took over, the Canal Zone was less of a construction site and more of a very expensive, very muddy cemetery. But the Americans brought something the French lacked: the steam shovel and a total pathological refusal to acknowledge that a mountain had any right to stay where God had put it. Under the direction of George Washington Goethals, a man whose name sounds like an industrial accident, we stopped trying to dig down to the sea and decided instead to lift the sea up to us. The artificial Sea of Gatun. The genius of the Panama Canal was not in the digging, but in the flooding. We built the Gatun Dam, which in 1913 was the largest man-made structure on Earth, and used it to block the Chagres River. We effectively turned a massive swath of tropical jungle into a giant artificial bathtub called Gatun Lake. Imagine the hubris required to look at a valley filled with ancient trees, indigenous villages, and thousands of years of ecological history and say, this would look better as a lake. In 1913, we didn't worry about environmental impact reports. If a tree was in the way of a steamship, the tree became a permanent resident of the lake floor. By the time the water reached its full height, we had created a man-made sea 85 feet above the level of the oceans. To get the ships there, we built the locks, giant concrete elevators that used the power of gravity to lift 10,000-ton vessels as if they were rubber ducks. It was the ultimate 1913 scientific miracle. We had turned the Earth's topography into a plumbing problem. The Gamboa Dike and the long-distance spark. The climax of this decade-long struggle occurred on October 10, 1913. There was only one thing left standing between the waters of the Gatun Lake and the Culebra Cut, the massive trench we had spent years carving through the mountains. That thing was the Gamboa Dike, a temporary wall of earth that kept the construction site dry. In a move that perfectly captured the technological smugness of 1913, we decided that blowing up this dike shouldn't be done by a local workman with a match. No, it had to be done with style. President Woodrow Wilson sat in the White House in Washington, D.C., surrounded by reporters and men in very stiff collars. He pressed a small golden telegraph button. That electrical signal traveled thousands of miles down the coast, through underwater cables, and across the Panamanian jungle, where it triggered the detonation of 8 tons of dynamite. It was the ultimate 1913 remote control. With a single click, a man in a velvet-lined office in Washington blew a hole in the side of a continent. It was the moment we realized that distance was no longer an excuse for being late to an explosion. The dike disintegrated in a spectacular geyser of mud and smoke, and the waters of the Atlantic side rushed in to meet the waters of the Pacific side. Well, technically, they met in the middle of a man-made trench, but for the sake of the newspapers, we called it the marriage of the oceans, the shaking of hands, and salt. When the Atlantic and Pacific finally shook hands at Gamboa, it was the end of a geographic era. We had successfully shortened the trip from New York to San Francisco by nearly 8,000 miles. We had turned a dangerous months-long odyssey into a pleasant 10-hour transit through a tropical garden. Of course, the two oceans didn't actually mix much. The locks kept them separated like two rival families at a wedding. But the symbolic victory was total. We had conquered the Great Divide. We had proven that if you have enough dynamite, enough steam shovels, and enough progressive willpower, the physical laws of the planet are merely suggestions. The ships began to move through in early 1914, but the filling of 1913 was the true emotional peak. It was the year we finished the impossible task. We had overcome the landslides that had buried our machines. We had overcome the yellowjack that had killed our workers, and we had overcome the sheer, stubborn mass of the Culebra Cut. The mosquito's last stand. We cannot discuss the filling of the canal without mentioning the real hero of 1913, the screen door. Before we could dig the dirt, we had to fight a war against the mosquito. Major William Gorgas had realized, to the laughter of the serious scientists, that the secret to building the canal wasn't in more dynamite, but in more oil. He spent years pouring oil on stagnant puddles, draining swamps, and putting screens on every window in Panama. By 1913, we hadn't just moved the earth. We had sanitized the jungle. We had turned one of the most lethal places on the planet into a place where a man could work an 8-hour shift and reasonably expect to be alive for dinner. It was the first great victory of modern public health, and it was the only reason the big button in Washington worked. If Gorgas hadn't killed the bugs, the ditch would have been filled with bones instead of water. The hubris of the unsinkable. As the water filled the locks in late 1913, the mood was one of quiet, supreme confidence. We were a world that could move mountains and merge oceans. We felt that we had finally finished the earth. We had connected every corner of the globe with wires, rails, and now a giant canal. There was a sense that nothing could stop us. We were building unsinkable ships like the Titanic. Well, that had been a minor setback, but we were sure the next ones would be fine. And unbreakable systems of trade. We believed the Panama Canal would ensure a new era of global peace, as no one would want to go to war and risk their shipping lanes. We had cut the world in half so that we could be closer together. It was a beautiful, rational 1913 dream. We didn't realize that being closer together just made it easier for everyone to reach out and hit each other. But that was a problem for 1914. In 1913, we were content to watch the water rise. We watched as the Pacific tides and the Atlantic currents were tamed by American concrete. We felt like gods with clipboards. We had conquered the wet veto of the jungle, and as the first tugboats began to test the locks, we stood on the banks and cheered for ourselves. We had performed the ultimate trick. We had made the world smaller, just so we could feel bigger. Chapter 17. The Great Flood of 1913. Nature's Liquid Veto. By the spring of 1913, the human race was feeling so puffed up with its own success that it's a wonder we didn't all just float away into the ozone layer we had recently discovered. We had just cut a continent in half in Panama. We were building skyscrapers that tickled the bellies of the clouds, and we had perfected the assembly line to the point where a man could be turned into a bolt-tightening automaton in under an hour. We were, in every sense of the word, dry and triumphant. But if there is one thing the great architect of the universe cannot abide, it is a creature that thinks it has mastered the plumbing. In March of 1913, just as we were congratulating ourselves on our scientific age, nature decided to issue a liquid veto so absolute and so damp that it turned the American Midwest into a temporary branch of the Atlantic Ocean. It was the Great Flood of 1913, a disaster that reminded us that while man might hold the stopwatch, Mother Nature still holds the bucket, and she has a very large bucket. The Easter Sunday surprise. The trouble began in late March around Easter Sunday. Now, usually, Easter in the Midwest is a time for fancy hats, questionable ham, and the optimistic hope that the frost has finally stopped trying to kill the hydrangeas. But in 1913, the atmosphere decided to stage a biblical rehearsal. A series of massive storm systems collided over the Ohio River Valley like a group of angry giants in a dark room. For 3 days, it didn't just rain. The sky simply opened up and poured out everything it had. In some places, nearly 10 inches of water fell in 48 hours. To put that in perspective for the landlubbers, that is enough water to turn a respectable cow pasture into a navigable waterway for a mid-sized destroyer. The ground, already saturated from a late winter thaw, looked at the first few inches and said, "I'm full." The rest of the water had nowhere to go but the streets, the basements, and eventually the second-story bedrooms of every town from Indiana to West Virginia. Dayton, the Silicon Valley of the swamp. The epicenter of this aquatic chaos was Dayton, Ohio. In 1913, Dayton was the shining jewel of American ingenuity. It was the home of the Wright brothers, who had taught us how to fly, and John H. Patterson, who had taught us how to count money with his National Cash Register, NCR, company. It was a city of inventors, engineers, and progressive thinkers who believed that every problem had a mechanical solution. Then the Miami River arrived in the downtown district. The levees, which had been built with the same good-enough-for-now philosophy that governs most municipal projects, didn't just leak, they vanished. On the morning of March the 25th, a wall of water 10 feet high roared through the streets of Dayton. It didn't care about topical authority or mechanical efficiency. It picked up horses, pianos, and entire houses and moved them 3 blocks over just for the sake of variety. The inhabitants of Dayton discovered quite suddenly that their modern city was actually a very elaborate aquarium, and they were the goldfish. The cash register king to the rescue. In every great disaster, there is a man who decides that he is the only one competent enough to handle the mess. In 1913, Dayton, that man was John H. Patterson. Patterson was the president of NCR, a man known for his eccentricities. He once fired a man for the way he ate his soup and his absolute dictatorial control over his factory. When the water started rising, Patterson didn't wait for a committee or a government telegram. He stood up on a desk and announced, "NCR is now in the rescue business." Within 24 hours, he had turned his factory, the same one that built the machines that rang up your groceries, into a shipyard. His carpenters stopped making cash register crates and started building flat-bottomed boats at a rate of one every 10 minutes. He turned the NCR office buildings into hospitals, soup kitchens, and dormitories. He organized a private army of rescuers and effectively became the benevolent dictator of Dayton, while the actual government was still trying to find its boots. Patterson's response was a triumph of the 1913 spirit. It was efficient, it was paternalistic, and it was slightly terrifying. He saved thousands of lives, and then, being a true marketing genius, he made sure that every newspaper in the country knew that NCR had saved Dayton. It was the first time corporate social responsibility was used as a blunt instrument of public relations. The irony of the unsinkable mentality. What made the 1913 flood so psychologically jarring was that it followed so closely on the heels of the Titanic disaster. A year prior, we had learned that we couldn't build an unsinkable ship. In 1913, we learned we couldn't build an unsinkable city. The flood didn't just drown the streets, it started fires. Because the water broke the gas lines, entire blocks of Dayton were simultaneously underwater and on fire. It was a scene of such surreal elemental conflict that it made the modern art of the Armory show look like a Hallmark card. People were trapped on their roofs, watching their neighbors' houses burn to the waterline while they shivered in a downpour. It was a moment of profound humility for the year of smugness. We realized that for all our steam shovels and our Bohr models, we were still just small, hairless primates living at the mercy of a planet that occasionally likes to rearrange the furniture. The birth of modern bureaucracy, the good kind. Once the water receded, leaving behind several million tons of stinking sulfuric mud and a collection of dead horses that would have troubled a philosopher, the people of the Miami Valley decided that never again was going to be their new motto. They didn't just pray for better weather, they did what 1,913 people did best. They organized. They formed the Miami Conservancy District. This was a revolutionary idea. It was the first time that an entire river basin was treated as a single system rather than a collection of separate towns. They hired Arthur Morgan, an engineer who looked like he had never smiled in his life and who viewed water as a personal enemy. Morgan designed a system of 5 massive dry dams that remain empty most of the time but hold back the water during a storm. To fund it, the people of the valley didn't wait for federal aid. They raised $2 million themselves. It was the ultimate 1913 pull-yourself-up-by-your-bootstraps move, except their bootstraps were currently covered in 2 feet of silt. This project became the blueprint for flood control around the world. It was progressivism in action, the belief that through science, engineering, and a relentless amount of paperwork, we could finally put nature in a box and keep her there. The lessons learned and ignored. The Great Flood of 1913 killed nearly 700 people and caused over $300 million in damage, a staggering sum in a year when you could buy a decent house for the price of a used motor car. It was the wet veto that ended the spring of our discontent. It taught us several things that we have been trying to forget ever since. Gravity is not a suggestion. Water will always go to the lowest point, regardless of how much you paid for the real estate. Infrastructure is boring until it breaks. Nobody wants to pay for a levy until they are standing on their dining room table. Nature doesn't care about your scientific age. A hurricane or a flood doesn't stop to read your PhD thesis before it knocks your house down. As the sun finally came out in April of 1913, the Midwest began the long, muddy process of scrubbing itself clean. We were a little less smug, a little more damp, and significantly more interested in the heights of our riverbanks. We had seen the Cathedral of the Commute in New York, but in Ohio, we had seen the Cathedral of the Current, and it was a much more terrifying place to worship. We were learning that progress is a two-way street. For every lock we filled in Panama, nature was ready to fill a basement in Dayton. It was a balancing of the ledgers, a reminder that the 16th Amendment wasn't the only tax we had to pay that year. Chapter 18, Death Valley's 134 degrees Fahrenheit record, the Mercury's nervous breakdown. By July of 1913, the planet was beginning to look like a man who had been invited to a black tie gala and was slowly realizing he had forgotten to put on his trousers. Having spent the first half of the year drowning the Midwest in a wet veto and cutting a continental gash through Panama, nature decided that the only appropriate way to celebrate the height of summer was to see exactly how close she could get the human race to a medium well finish. If the Great Flood was a reminder that we are made of water, the summer of 1913 was a reminder that we are also made of things that melt. On July 10th, in a corner of California that had been named with a refreshing if somewhat discouraging honesty, the Earth decided to set a world record that stands to this day. I am speaking, of course, of the day the mercury hit 134 degrees Fahrenheit in Death Valley. The naming of the oven. To understand the sheer audacity of this record, one must first consider the place. Death Valley is not a name chosen by a marketing committee looking to increase tourism. It was named by a group of gold seekers in 1849 who had taken a shortcut that turned out to be a scenic route through the outer vestibule of Hades. As they finally climbed out of the valley, one of them supposedly looked back and whispered, "Goodbye, Death Valley." It stuck. In 1913, however, we were in our scientific age, and we weren't content with just having a place with a scary name. We wanted to put a thermometer in it. We wanted to quantify the misery. We wanted to know exactly how hot it had to be before a man's thoughts evaporated out of his ears. Oscar Denton, the loneliest man in the world. The hero, or perhaps the victim of this story, is a man named Oscar Denton. In 1913, Oscar was the caretaker and weather observer at Furnace Creek Ranch. Think about that name for a moment. Furnace Creek. It's as if the pioneers were trying to warn future generations, but we were too busy with our bore models and our assembly lines to listen. Oscar's job was to step outside every day into a landscape that looked like the surface of a disgruntled brick and read a set of glass tubes filled with mercury. On July 10th, Oscar stepped onto his porch and likely felt as though he had been hit in the face with a heated shovel. The air wasn't just hot, it was aggressive. It was the kind of heat that doesn't just sit on you, it bites. It sucks the moisture out of your eyeballs and turns your personality into a thin, brittle crust. Oscar checked the maximum thermometer, adjusted his hat, which was probably smoking at the edges, and recorded a temperature of 134 degrees Fahrenheit, 56.7 degrees Celsius. the physics of frying. To the expert of 1913, this was a magnificent data point. It was the ultimate record. We had the highest skyscraper, the fastest assembly line, and now the hottest dirt. We felt that by measuring the heat, we had somehow conquered it. But for the man on the ground, 134 degrees is not a data point. It is a physical assault. At 100 degrees, you are uncomfortable. At 110 degrees, you are complaining to your neighbors about the government. At 120 degrees, you are wondering if your ancestors were actually smart for moving to the desert. At 134 degrees, your brain starts to perform the Death Valley Shuffle, where you forget your middle name and begin to believe that the rocks are actually made of caramel. In 1913, there was no air conditioning. There were no electric fans for Oscar Denton. There was only the shade of a few thirsty tamarisk trees and the hope that the sun would eventually go down. Although in Death Valley in July, the sun doesn't go down so much as it just hides behind a mountain and continues to glow like a radioactive orange. It was the kind of heat that makes a man realize that the long peace of the 19th century was entirely dependent on a reasonable supply of ice. The record that refuses to die. For over a century, scientists have argued about Oscar Denton's reading. They have suggested that perhaps the thermometer was poorly placed, or that a localized dust storm had created a microclimate of insanity. They have tried to debunk it, to strike it from the record, to say it was an observational error. But the 134-degree record has a 1913 stubbornness to it. It reflects an era that was obsessed with the extreme. We wanted the biggest, the loudest, the fastest, and the hottest. We were a world that was heating up in every sense of the word. Our industries were burning more coal than ever. Our politics were reaching a boiling point in the Balkans. And even our art was explosive. Death Valley's record was just nature's way of keeping pace with our own frantic energy. It was as if the earth looked at Henry Ford's assembly line and said, "You think that's a furnace? Hold my beer." Though, as we learned in Chapter 15, the beer was increasingly illegal, which only made the heat feel more personal. The mirage of stability. As the mercury climbed to 134, the horizon in Death Valley would have become a shimmering liquid mess. This is the mirage, the optical illusion that makes you see water where there is only sand. In many ways, 1913 itself was a mirage. We looked at our progress and saw a lake of permanent prosperity. We looked at our scientific banks and our populous senators and saw a stable, hydrated future. We didn't realize that we were standing in the middle of a desert and that the water we saw on the horizon was just a trick of the light. We were a world that was overheated. We had too much ambition, too much nationalism, and too much faith in our own cleverness. We were like Oscar Denton, standing on a porch in 134-degree heat, proudly recording the temperature while our house was slowly beginning to sizzle. The aftermath of the heat wave. The heat wave of 1913 didn't just stay in Death Valley. It scorched the Midwest and the Great Plains, killing thousands of people and destroying crops. It was the hot veto that followed the wet veto. It reminded us that for all our mastery of the Panama Canal, we couldn't control the thermostat of the planet. Oscar Denton survived the day. He went back inside, presumably sat in a tub of tepid water, and prepared for the next day, which was a chilly 129 degrees. He was a 1913 man. He did his job, he kept his records, and he didn't complain about the existential dread of a world on fire. He just made sure the ink didn't dry in his pen before he could finish the logbook. As we move into the final months of the year, the heat of July remains in our bones. We have seen the extremes of nature. We have seen the heights of the skyscrapers and the depths of the valley. We have measured everything that can be measured. And now, as the shadows begin to lengthen over 1913, we turn our eyes away from the desert and toward the flicker of a movie screen. Because when the world gets too hot, too fast, and too complicated to understand, the only thing left to do is find a dark theater and laugh at a small man with a cane. Chapter 19. The Tramp is Born, the most famous silence in history. By the tail end of 1913, the human race had become a bit like a man who has spent all day organizing his spice rack, sharpening his pencils, and filing his taxes, only to realize he has forgotten how to actually tell a joke. We had built a world of terrifying precision. We had the assembly line to tell us how to move, the Federal Reserve to tell us what our money was worth, and the Bohr model to tell us that even our atoms were behaving like a well-regulated clock. We were efficient, we were scientific, and we were, dare I say it, becoming a bit of a bore. It is a well-known psychological phenomenon that when a society becomes too rigid, it eventually develops a desperate, twitching need to see someone trip over a bucket. And so, in December of 1913, the universe provided us with the ultimate antidote to the year of smugness. A young English vaudevillian, with a mop of dark curls and a restless spirit, signed a contract with Keystone Studios in California. His name was Charlie Chaplin, and he was about to prove that in an age of roaring machines and screaming politicians, the most powerful thing you could do was stay absolutely quiet and lose your trousers. The Keystone Chaos Factory. To understand the birth of the Tramp, you have to understand Mack Sennett's Keystone Studios. It was not a place of high art. It was a place where logic went to die, and where the slapstick was the only law of the land. The Keystone Cops were a group of actors whose primary job was to fall out of moving vehicles, run into walls, and be hit in the face with various baked goods. It was a factory of frenzy, a mechanical assembly line of comedy that moved at the same breakneck speed as Henry Ford's Highland Park plant. Chaplin arrived at Keystone feeling a bit like a classical violinist who had accidentally wandered into a tavern brawl. He was a trained mime, a student of the subtle gesture and the delicate timing of the London stage. Sennett, however, wanted action. He wanted people to move fast, hit hard, and fall down often. For the first few weeks of 1913, Chaplin was a man without a face. He was just another body in the blur of the silent screen, struggling to find his footing in a medium that seemed to prize the kick in the pants over the wink of the eye. The wardrobe of contradictions. The legend of the Tramp, that iconic figure of the baggy pants, the tight coat, the oversized shoes, and the undersized hat, is one of those happy accidents that history occasionally tosses us when we aren't looking. In early February, just as the 1913 film schedule was being finalized, Mack Sennett told Chaplin to go into the wardrobe and get into a comedy makeup. Chaplin, feeling a bit contrary and wanting to stand out from the other cops, decided to build a costume out of opposites. He took the largest pants he could find and paired them with the smallest coat. He put on shoes that were meant for a giant and a hat that was meant for a child. He added a small toothbrush mustache because it made him look older without hiding his expressions. When he walked onto the set, he wasn't just a man in a funny suit. He was a visual paradox. He was an aristocrat in a beggar's rags. He was a gentleman who lived in a gutter. He was a man who bowed to a lady while his shoes were literally falling apart. He was the ghost in the machine of 1913. While the rest of the world was trying to be great, modern, and efficient, the tramp was simply trying to survive a walk down the street without being crushed by the weight of his own dignity. The global language of the kick. The tramp's rise to fame was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Because the movies were silent, there was no language barrier. A man in a village in China, a factory worker in Detroit, and a countess in Paris could all watch the same film and understand exactly what was happening. They didn't need a translator to tell them that it is funny when a man accidentally sits on a hot stove. In 1913, we were trying to globalize through trade, treaties, and canals. But Chaplin globalized through the human nervous system. He became the first truly universal human being, the first face that was recognized on every continent simultaneously. He was the mass media incarnate. It is a profound irony that in a year where we invented the crossword puzzle to challenge our vocabularies and the Bohr model to challenge our intellects, our greatest hero was a man who never said a word. He spoke the language of the underdog. He was the little guy fighting against the giant, unfeeling systems of the era, the same systems we had spent all of 1913 building. The tramp versus the assembly line. There is a reason the tramp resonated so deeply with the people of 1913. We were becoming a world of standardization. As we saw in Chapter 5, Henry Ford wanted to turn every man into a predictable part of a machine. But the tramp was the ultimate unpredictable part. He was the wrench in the gears. He was the man who couldn't or wouldn't fit into the mold. When the tramp walked through a 1913 film, he was constantly at odds with the modern world. He was chased by police, flummoxed by revolving doors, and confounded by the new technology. He represented our collective fear that we were losing our humanity to the moving belt. By laughing at him, we were actually laughing at our own frustration with a world that was moving too fast and asking too much of us. He was the veto on the industrial age. He was the reminder that even if you have a 134-degree heat record, an ozone layer, and a Panama Canal, you are still just a creature that can be brought low by a banana peel. The invention of the star. Before 1913, actors were mostly anonymous. They were the Biograph Girl or the Keystone Guy. But by the end of the year, people were asking for the little fellow. Chaplin was the first to realize that in the new age of the camera, the individual was the brand. He wasn't just an employee of Keystone. He was an owner of the public's imagination. He ushered in the era of the celebrity, a concept that would eventually become more powerful than most of the governments we've discussed in this book. In 1913, a king's horse could cause a riot at the Derby, but by 1914, a Charlie Chaplin appearance could cause a riot in any city on earth. We had replaced the divine right of kings with the visual right of the movie star. It was a shift from the dignity of the 19th century to the visibility of the 20th. We were no longer a world of readers. We were becoming a world of watchers. And the man we were watching most closely was a man who was teaching us that the only way to deal with the chaos of modern life was to twirl a cane and keep on walking. The final verdict on 1913. As the calendar pages of 1913 began to flutter toward the floor, the tramp stood as the final judge of our progress. We had done so much. We had taxed our incomes, filled our canals, and measured our atoms. We felt so very, very important. But as Charlie Chaplin signed his contract and stepped in front of the lens, he offered us a different perspective. He showed us that progress is often just a fancy word for a new way to fall down. He showed us that the more civilized we became, the more we needed the vulgar joy of a well-timed pratfall. The year of smugness was ending on a high note of hilarity. We were laughing because we didn't know what was coming next. We were laughing because the movies told us that no matter how many times we were kicked, we could always get up, adjust our bowler hats, and head toward the horizon. We were a world at its peak, blissfully unaware that we were about to walk off a cliff. But for a few brief moments in December of 1913, we weren't worried about the cliff. We were just waiting for the next reel to begin. Chapter 20, 1914, is Loading the Pistol, the Sunday night of history. If history were a week-long cruise, the year 1913 was the glorious Sunday afternoon. The buffet was still open, the band was playing a jaunty ragtime tune, and we were all standing on the deck admiring the sunset, convinced that the ship was unsinkable and the ocean was merely a scenic backdrop for our own collective brilliance. We had spent the last 12 months tidying up the planet like a nervous host before a gala. We had organized our atoms, taxed our incomes, filled our canals, and even invented the crossword puzzle so we'd have something to do while waiting for the future to arrive. We were, as I have mentioned before, insufferably smug. We believed that the long peace, that century-old stretch of relative calm that had existed since Napoleon finally stopped trying to turn Europe into his personal walk-in closet, was a permanent feature of the human condition. We thought we had outgrown war, much like a teenager thinks he has outgrown his temper, right up until the moment someone touches his bicycle. We were a world of skyscrapers and assembly lines, of electricity and ozone. We were civilized with a capital C, and we were quite certain that 1914 would simply be more of the same, only with slightly faster cars and perhaps a few more three-letter words for Egyptian sun god. The great illusion of interdependence. The leading thinkers of 1913, men with very high collars and very low opinions of anyone who didn't speak their language, had a theory. They called it the Great Illusion. The idea was that the world's economies were now so tightly woven together by trade, telegraphs, and the gold standard that a major war was physically impossible. War is a bad investment, the bankers said, clutching their Federal Reserve ledgers. It would interrupt the shipping of coffee and the sale of silk stockings. No rational nation would commit financial suicide for the sake of a border dispute. It was a beautiful, rational 1913 dream. It assumed that human beings are essentially logical creatures who prioritize their stock portfolios over their ancient grudges. It failed to account for the fact that humanity has a long and storied history, of burning down the house just to spite the neighbor's cat. We had built a global machine of prosperity, but we had forgotten that machines are remarkably good at being turned into weapons. The Balkans, the powder keg, in the basement. While we were busy admiring the ceiling of Grand Central Terminal, the basement of the world, a charming little corner called the Balkans, was currently on fire. In 1913, there were two Balkan Wars, which most people in London and New York viewed as a localized form of aggressive landscaping. We treated the Balkan tensions like a distant thunderstorm, something that might ruin a picnic in Sarajevo, but certainly wouldn't affect the price of tea in Boston. We didn't realize that the great powers of Europe had tied themselves together in a series of defense treaties that were essentially a diplomatic suicide pact. An alliance is an agreement between two nations to share the blame for a mistake neither of them wanted to make in the first place. Russia was the big brother to the Slavs. Germany was the big brother to the Austrians. France was the big brother to everyone who hated the Germans. And Britain was the big brother to anyone who threatened the sea. It was a giant, interconnected web of ego and gunpowder. If a single person in a dusty corner of Europe sneezed, the entire world was obligated to catch a cold. Sarajevo, the man with the sandwich. As 1913 turned into 1914, a young man named Gavrilo Princip was currently checking his calendar. He was a teenager with a lot of revolutionary fervor, a very thin coat, and a world-class case of tuberculosis. He and his friends in the Black Hand were tired of the Austro-Hungarian Empire telling them what to do. The history books often portray the events leading up to the Great War as a series of grand, inevitable movements. In reality, it was a series of spectacular blunders. By early 1914, the pistol was being loaded. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, decided to visit Sarajevo in an open-topped car. It was like a man deciding to walk through a hornet's nest wearing nothing but honey. The first assassins failed. They threw a bomb that missed, and the Archduke, displaying that special kind of royal stubbornness that usually leads to a change in management, decided to continue his tour anyway. Then came the wrong turn. The Archduke's driver took a wrong street, realized his mistake, and stalled the car directly in front of a deli where Gavrilo Princip was, according to legend, currently eating a sandwich. Princip looked up from his lunch, saw the target of his dreams sitting 5 feet away in a stalled vehicle, and pulled the trigger. 2 shots. That was all it took. 1 for the Archduke, 1 for his wife, and 10 million for the rest of humanity. The long piece had been shot in the heart by a man who couldn't believe his luck. 1914, the lights go out. The tragedy of 1913 is that we were so ready for the future, but we were looking in the wrong direction. We were looking at the Panama Canal, thinking about the marriage of the oceans. We weren't looking at the trench, which was about to become the permanent residence for a generation of young men. In August of 1914, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, looked out of his window at the streetlights of London and said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He was right. The scientific age was about to be used to create mustard gas in tanks. The moving assembly line was about to start producing machine guns instead of Model Ts. The Bohr model was the first step on a road that would eventually lead to the mushroom cloud. We had mastered the world, but we hadn't mastered ourselves. We were like a child who has been given a set of power tools and immediately decides to see if the cat is made of wood. The Twain Final Verdict. So, what is the final verdict on 1913? It was a year of gilded illusions. It was the last year of a world that believed in progress without cost, in science without consequence, and in borders without blood. We were a species at our most creative and our most delusional. We had reached the peak of our civilization, and the view from the top was so beautiful that we failed to notice the ground rushing up to meet us. We look back at 1913 with a certain nostalgic pity. We see the women in their big hats and the men in their stiff collars, and we want to shout at them, "Stop! Go home! Don't go to Sarajevo! Check the brakes on the locomotive!" But history doesn't have a back button, even if we did invent the crossword puzzle to help us remember the past. 1913 was the end of the old world. Everything that came after, the wars, the revolutions, the Cold Wars, and the digital age, was born in the ashes of that Sunday afternoon. We are all children of 1913, living in the houses that they built, paying the taxes that they invented, and trying to solve the puzzles that they left on the table. As the curtain falls on our fall asleep to hilarious history, remember this. History is not a series of dates. It is a series of people who were just as confused, just as smug, and just as hopeful as we are. They did their best with what they had, which in 1913 was a lot of coal, a few airplanes, and a very good sense of humor. Good night, 1913. You were a magnificent, messy, and hilarious year. We'll see you in the morning, but I suspect the world is going to look a lot different when we wake up. The end. This has been Mark Twain.